Welcome to Quiet Chronicles. Settle in for a life that almost refused to stay still, a sickly child who trained himself into a symbol of strength, a reformer who fought his own party, a president who challenged corporations, defended forests, built power into the White House, and still kept searching for one more frontier after the highest office in America was already behind him. Theodore Roosevelt is often remembered as force, energy, and noise, but behind that public image was a more interesting story: illness, grief, discipline, ambition, moral certainty, political calculation, and a restless belief that history belonged to those willing to push against it. Before we begin, if you enjoy long form biographies and full historical stories told in this calm documentary style, a like helps more than you might think. Subscribe as well because new stories are published every week. And as you listen, let us know in the comments where you are listening from. If there is a person, topic, story, or era you would like Quiet Chronicles to cover next, leave that there too. For now, the noise around the later president can fall away, and the story can return to the beginning. A New York household, a fragile child, and the first quiet fight of Theodore Roosevelt's life. Chapter 1: The Sickly Child of East 20th Street. The first fight of Theodore Roosevelt's life did not take place in a legislature, a police department, a battlefield, or the White House. It took place in a bedroom in a wealthy New York household where a small boy struggled for breath while his family tried the remedies that 19th century medicine could offer. Asthma was not a passing inconvenience for him. It shaped the rhythm of his childhood, narrowed what he could do, and made weakness a daily fact before ambition had any public name. Later Americans would remember Roosevelt as motion, appetite, and command, but the beginning was more fragile than the legend allowed. Theodore Roosevelt was born on October 27, 1858, at 28 East 20th Street in New York City. His family belonged to the comfortable world of old Knickerbocker respectability, with money, social standing, and a sense that privilege carried duties as well as ease. His father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., was a merchant and philanthropist whose seriousness left a permanent mark on the children around him. His mother, Martha Bullock Roosevelt, came from Georgia, bringing into the household a Southern memory and manner that sat uneasily beside the Northern world her husband served. In that house, the Civil War would not be an abstraction when it came. It would divide sympathies at the family table. Wealth protected the Roosevelt children from many ordinary hardships, but it could not protect Theodore from his own lungs. Asthma visited him with a force that alarmed the household, and nights of illness became part of family memory. Doctors offered treatments that now seem limited and sometimes strange, yet families of the period worked with what they had: warmth, movement, strong coffee, fresh air, patent medicines, and anxious attendance through the small hours. His father sometimes took him out into the night air in a carriage, hoping the movement and coolness might ease his breathing. The image is often repeated because it contains so much of the future life in miniature: a sick child, a devoted father, and the belief that action might answer suffering. Theodore Roosevelt Sr. stood at the center of his son's moral world. He was affectionate, demanding, religious without theatrical display, and involved in charitable work at a time when elite philanthropy carried both genuine benevolence and social authority. He helped found institutions, supported aid for the poor, and gave time as well as money. To his son, he seemed nearly complete as a man, tender in private and useful in public. Roosevelt later wrote of him with a reverence that never really faded, and that reverence mattered because it gave the boy a model of masculinity grounded not only in strength, but in service. Martha Bullock Roosevelt gave the household a different inheritance. She had grown up in Georgia, and her brothers served the Confederate cause during the Civil War, while her husband supported the Union. The children therefore lived inside a domestic version of the national fracture, with loyalty, affection, and political allegiance crossing one another in ways that could not be made simple. Theodore was still young during the war, but the family atmosphere taught him early that history entered private rooms. A nation could divide, and the division could pass through kinship without dissolving it. Illness kept Theodore from the ordinary schooling that might have shaped a healthier boy. He was taught largely at home, where lessons could bend around his condition and his uneven strength. Tutors, family instruction, reading, and travel gave him an education that was privileged but irregular. He learned from books, from adults, from museums, from specimens, and from the close study of things that caught his attention. The pattern suited him more than a narrow classroom might have done, because his mind moved eagerly when it found something concrete to grasp. Natural history became one of those concrete worlds. As a boy, Roosevelt collected insects, birds, skulls, skins, and small animals with a seriousness that could surprise adults. He created what he called the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History inside the family home, and the name, childish as it was, reveals the scale of his intention. He did not merely like animals. He wanted to classify them, preserve them, arrange them, and understand their place in the order of living things. A dead seal seen in a market reportedly fascinated him so much that he obtained its skull, and from such objects the child built a private discipline of observation. This habit of collecting was not gentle in the modern sentimental sense. 19th century natural history often involved killing, skinning, mounting, measuring, and labeling specimens, and Roosevelt absorbed that world fully. The same boy who struggled for breath could be exacting with a bird skin or a skull, learning patience from the physical work of preservation. There was a procedural calm in it. The specimen had to be handled, cleaned, recorded, placed. In later life, when he wrote about nature, hunted across continents, and supported museum collections, he was extending an interest that had begun in the rooms of his childhood home. His eyesight added another difficulty. Roosevelt was severely nearsighted, though this was not fully understood in his earliest years. The world beyond a short distance came to him blurred, and once glasses corrected the problem, the change seems to have opened more than vision. It offered one more example of a limitation that could be named and answered. Asthma could not be solved so neatly, but poor sight could be met with lenses, and the boy learned again that weakness did not always have to remain mysterious. A decisive moment came when his father told him that he had the mind but not the body, and that without the body the mind could not go as far as it should. The sentence became part of Roosevelt family memory because the child accepted it almost as a command. Exercise was not only recreation after that, it became moral work. A small gymnasium was arranged for him, and Theodore began the slow labor of building strength where nature had given him little ease. The effort did not cure him in any simple way, but it gave him a language for living with limitation. Discipline entered his life through repetition rather than revelation. He exercised, rode when he could, walked, studied, collected, and pushed against the edge of fatigue. The child who could be kept indoors by illness also belonged to a family that traveled, and travel widened his sense of the world beyond New York. Trips to Europe and the Middle East exposed him to museums, landscapes, languages, and old civilizations, though he often encountered them through the practical frustrations of health, movement, and family schedule. Even privilege required endurance when the body did not cooperate. Elliot Roosevelt, Theodore's younger brother, brought another kind of shadow into the family story. Charming, affectionate, and troubled, Elliot would later struggle with alcoholism and instability, becoming a painful figure in the Roosevelt household. In childhood, the brothers shared family life before their paths separated into very different forms of vulnerability. Theodore turned strain into discipline and public achievement. Eliot's life showed that charm and birth could not always protect a person from inward disorder. The contrast would remain close to Theodore, not least because Eliot's daughter, Eleanor Roosevelt, would later carry the family name into another presidency. Corinne Roosevelt, Theodore's younger sister, also formed part of the intimate world that made his early life less solitary than the public myth sometimes suggests. The Roosevelt children lived among adults who expected manners, reading, faith, duty, and family loyalty. Their home was not a rough school of democratic hardship. It was a cultivated, prosperous household filled with servants, relatives, books, and the expectations of class. That fact matters because Roosevelt's later celebration of strenuous life did not rise from poverty or exclusion. It rose from a privileged child's refusal to be mastered by physical frailty. The Civil War ended when Theodore was still young, but its moral and political atmosphere lingered through Reconstruction and the arguments that followed. His father's decision not to fight in the Union Army, hiring a substitute instead as the law allowed, later troubled Theodore in ways that reveal the stern code he came to apply to himself. The elder Roosevelt had served the Union through relief work and support institutions, but his son belonged to a generation that increasingly measured manhood through direct public risk. The difference did not erase Theodore's devotion to his father. It gave that devotion a complicated edge. From the beginning, then, Roosevelt's life contained elements that would later appear on a national scale. Illness taught him resistance. Wealth gave him access. Family duty gave him a moral vocabulary. Natural history gave him habits of observation. The Civil War household taught him that public causes could divide private loyalties. His father's example joined tenderness to civic action, while his own body taught him that desire alone did not make strength. Before there was a Rough Rider, a reformer, or a president, there was a boy learning that life would have to be met deliberately, breath by breath, habit by habit, until discipline became the form his ambition first took. Chapter 2: A Young Man Made by Discipline. Theodore Roosevelt entered young adulthood with a body he had already learned to treat almost as a task. Illness had not disappeared from his life, and weakness had not been erased by will, But the boy who had once struggled through asthmatic nights had begun to build habits around the refusal to be passive. Exercise, study, collecting, and writing all belonged to that refusal. He did not yet know what public form his ambition would take, but he had already accepted the private rule that a life had to be worked upon before it could be used. Harvard received him in 1876, the same year the United States was marking its centennial and arguing bitterly over the disputed presidential election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel J. Tilden. Roosevelt arrived at college from the protected world of family tutors, travel, books, and private discipline, carrying both confidence and awkwardness. He was wealthy, earnest, nearsighted, intense, and socially recognizable as the son of an established New York family. Yet Harvard also placed him among young men who could measure him in ways his household could not. In lecture rooms, clubs, athletic spaces, and boarding arrangements, he had to turn his self-command into something visible among peers. His studies first leaned toward natural history, and that choice was not accidental. The habits of boyhood collecting had given him a way of paying attention to the world that felt exact, orderly, and alive. Birds, mammals, anatomy, classification, and field observation all drew him because they joined physical fact to intellectual pattern. Roosevelt's early seriousness about science was real enough that at one point a career in natural history did not seem impossible. He had the collector's patience, the hunter's eye, and the writer's appetite for description, though his future would eventually carry those gifts into politics rather than a museum post. A problem lay in the science itself. Roosevelt's eyesight was poor, and the laboratory work required by professional natural history was changing. Microscopes, technical specialization, and exact biological training were becoming more important than the gentleman naturalist style he had inherited from boyhood. He could observe, collect, and describe with energy, but the profession was moving toward methods that did not suit him as naturally. That is one of the small turns on which a life can shift. A young man who might have become a naturalist remained instead a politician who wrote about nature, hunted seriously, and later made conservation part of national government. Discipline at Harvard did not remain only intellectual. Roosevelt boxed, rode, walked, and trained his body with the same moral urgency that had begun in the gymnasium his father had encouraged. Boxing mattered to him partly because it offered contact with fear in a controlled form. He was not naturally powerful in the way later legend sometimes suggests, and his body had to be coaxed and pressed into usefulness. The ring gave him rules, pain, embarrassment, improvement, and a standard that could not be satisfied by intention alone. In that sense, physical training became another education in reality. There was also a social lesson in the athletic world. Harvard was not the frontier, not a battlefield, and not the rough democracy Roosevelt later praised, but it still placed young men into hierarchies of strength, nerve, and recognition. A frail boy from a refined household could not become a different person overnight. He could, however, learn to be less protected by his own delicacy. Every bout, walk, ride, and contest added a little more evidence to the argument he was making with himself. He was not trying merely to feel better. He was trying to become the sort of man who would never have to excuse himself from the demands of public life. The death of Theodore Roosevelt Sr. in 1878 cut through these college years with a force that shaped the rest of Theodore's life. His father had been the central moral figure of his childhood, and losing him while still a student left more than ordinary grief. It removed the living witness before whom Theodore had measured himself. In later memory, the elder Roosevelt remained almost impossibly good, a man whose combination of strength, tenderness, piety, and service his son never stopped trying to honor. The son did not imitate him exactly. He made the inheritance harder, more martial, more public, and more restless. After his father's death, Roosevelt's seriousness deepened, though not always in a somber form. He continued to study, exercise, socialize, and write. He also began to think more directly about public questions, especially as reform politics appealed to young men who believed corruption had stained the Republic after the Civil War. The Gilded Age was a world of enormous fortunes, party machines, railroad power, urban growth, and government offices treated as rewards. To a young man raised on duty and sharpened by self-discipline, the idea that public office might be bought, traded, or wasted could feel like a personal insult to civic honor. Henry Cabot Lodge became one of the important figures in this movement from private formation toward public life. Lodge, older than Roosevelt and already intellectually formed, belonged to the same world of educated Republican reform, historical interest, and national ambition. Their friendship would last for decades, though it was not a friendship of identical temperaments. Lodge was colder, more controlled, and more patrician in style. Roosevelt was warmer, louder, and more visibly eager. Together they formed part of a generation of elite Republicans who wanted reform, but who also believed strongly in national power, social order, and the responsibilities of educated men. Roosevelt's writing began early enough to matter. While still young, he worked on what became the Naval War of 1812, a serious historical study that appeared in 1882. The project showed several things at once: his appetite for military history, his respect for preparation, his interest in national honor, and his ability to turn research into public authority. It also revealed how naturally he connected history to character. Ships, commanders, decisions, and preparedness were not just technical subjects to him. They were evidence of whether a nation had taken itself seriously. Marriage entered his life with Alice Hathaway Lee, whom he met while at Harvard and came to adore with an openness that softened the hard edges of his self-making. Alice was remembered as gentle, beautiful, and socially admired, and Roosevelt's love for her carried the intensity with which he tended to attach himself to people and causes. Their engagement and marriage gave him a private future that seemed, for a brief time, to complete the public one just beginning to form. He had money, education, a beloved wife, reforming ambition, and the confidence of a young man who believed effort could answer almost anything. Yet the calm surface of that future should not be overstated. Roosevelt was already a young man of strong opinions, strong habits, and strong self-belief. He could be charming, but he could also be exhausting. His moral certainty gave him courage, and it also gave him little patience for those who did not share his pace. This combination would carry him upward and repeatedly create conflict. In college and early adulthood, the trait could still appear as youthful intensity. In politics, it would become both weapon and burden. The question of what to do with his life did not answer itself at once. Law seemed possible. Writing had already begun. Public service attracted him, and family expectations did not require him to earn a living in the ordinary way. His social position gave him freedom, but freedom of that sort can scatter a person unless some inner demand gives it direction. Roosevelt's direction came from the belief that character had to be tested in use. A private gentleman's life, comfortable and cultivated, would not be enough. Politics offered the test. It was dirty enough to repel many men of Roosevelt's class, but that was part of its attraction. If public life had been degraded by machines and patronage, then entering it could be presented as service rather than ambition, though ambition was certainly there. The young Roosevelt did not see contradiction in that mixture. He wanted office, and he wanted office to matter. He wanted honor, and he wanted public recognition for acting honorably. He wanted to fight corruption, and he wanted to be seen fighting it. When Roosevelt left Harvard and moved toward law and politics, he was not leaving discipline behind. He was carrying it into a harsher room. The body he had trained, the mind he had filled with history and natural science, the memory of his father, the companionship of reform-minded friends, and the affection of Alice all traveled with him into the first stage of his public career. New York politics would not receive him gently. Its men had their own rules, their own loyalties, and their own ways of making young reformers look foolish. That was why it suited him. A life built against resistance needed another resistance to meet, and the New York Assembly would soon give Theodore Roosevelt a world in which manners, conviction, and ambition had to survive contact with the machine. Chapter 3: The Assemblyman Against the Machine. The New York Assembly was not waiting for Theodore Roosevelt. When he entered it in 1882, he was 23 years old, wealthy, well-dressed, recently married, and still young enough to be mistaken for a visitor from a more polished world than the one in which state politics actually worked. Albany had its own habits, its own bargains, and its own language of favors. Men did not need to speak openly of corruption for corruption to be understood. A position might be promised, a bill might be delayed, a committee might be arranged, and influence could pass through a room without leaving much evidence behind. Roosevelt came into that world as the elected representative from a Republican district in New York City. His background made him unusual, but it did not make him powerless. Old family standing, reform connections, and personal confidence gave him a platform, while his youth gave him the strange advantage of being underestimated. Some older politicians saw him as a curiosity, a Harvard gentleman with spectacles, high manners, and too many convictions. That judgment was not wholly unfair. He was earnest to the point of impatience, and he believed that moral clarity should be allowed to move faster than custom. Albany soon taught him otherwise. Procedure mattered there. Bills moved or stopped through committees, friendships, party discipline, and private understandings that were not printed in official rules. A reformer who only denounced the system from a distance could remain pure and irrelevant. Roosevelt wanted to be effective, which meant learning the machinery closely enough to use it. That was one of the early lessons politics gave him. The machine could be opposed only by someone willing to study its parts. His first months in the assembly also revealed how much performance belonged to political life. Roosevelt's voice, gestures, and clothes drew attention, and his opponents sometimes treated him as a young aristocrat playing at public virtue. He did not yet have the heavier authority that age, office, and national fame would later give him. What he had instead was stamina. He read bills, attended to procedure, spoke with force, and learned which men could be persuaded, which had to be exposed, and which were best left alone until the numbers changed. Roscoe Conkling's shadow still lay across New York Republican politics, even after his resignation from the United States Senate in 1881. Conkling's world had been one of patronage, loyalty, and personal command, tied to the larger struggle over the spoils system that had divided Republicans after the Civil War. Roosevelt did not enter politics as a full outsider to party. He was a Republican by conviction and inheritance. Yet he belonged to the younger reform wing that believed the party could not retain honor if public offices remained prizes in a private game. Civil service reform therefore became one of his early causes. The issue could sound dry, and in one sense it was dry. Examinations, appointments, qualifications, tenure, and administrative rules. But to Roosevelt and men like him, these details carried moral weight because they decided whether government belonged to competence or to favor. A post office appointment, a customs position, a clerkship, or a local office might seem small when considered alone. Taken together, such positions formed the daily face of government, and the spoils system taught citizens that loyalty could matter more than merit. In Albany, Roosevelt found that reform required allies who did not all share his temperament. Some were older, some more cautious, some less eager to speak publicly than he was. He learned to work through committees and investigations, to gather documents, and to make charges in ways that could not be dismissed as youthful noise. One of his most visible early efforts involved exposing corruption around a state judge, a campaign that showed his appetite for direct confrontation. The matter gave him a public reputation as a young man willing to challenge figures whom others preferred to leave untouched. The miniature of Roosevelt in those assembly rooms is not the image of a quiet clerk of reform. He could be theatrical, and he could enjoy the attention that came with righteous attack. Yet the theatrical element should not obscure the labor beneath it. Legislative work required wading through sessions, reading language others wanted ignored, following amendments, and discovering where small changes could protect large interests. Roosevelt's gift was not patience in the mild sense. It was the ability to keep pressure on an object once he had decided it mattered. The New York of those years gave him many objects. Railroads, municipal influence, patronage networks, corporate favors, and party bosses shaped political life in ways that could not be separated cleanly from the economic growth of the Gilded Age. Money had become large, cities had become complicated, and parties had become skilled at converting public authority into private advantage. Roosevelt did not yet possess a complete theory of modern regulation. That would come later in the presidency. In the assembly, he was learning the older reformers' craft of naming abuses and forcing them into the open. His social class both helped and hindered him. It gave him independence from some of the pressures that bound poorer politicians to party favor. He did not need a salary to survive, and he could afford to offend men who controlled lesser careers. At the same time, his background made it easy for enemies to accuse him of arrogance. Reformers from comfortable families often faced that charge, not always without reason. Roosevelt's answer was effort, and effort became his credential. He tried to show that he would do the work, not merely pronounce on it. The presidential election of 1884 tested that identity with unusual force. The Republican Party nominated James G. Blaine, a gifted and popular figure whose reputation among reformers was clouded by allegations of corruption. Many Republican reformers, later called mugwumps, broke away and supported the Democratic nominee Grover Cleveland, who had built a reputation for honesty in New York. For Roosevelt, the choice was painful because it placed party loyalty against reform principle. His public life had barely begun, and already the two things he wanted to hold together were pulling apart. Roosevelt chose to stay with the Republican Party. The decision angered reformers who believed Blaine represented everything they had been resisting. It also revealed something important about Roosevelt's political mind. He could rebel against bosses, expose corruption, and speak the language of civic righteousness. But he was not naturally a bolter. Party was not a casual label to him. It was an instrument of power, a structure through which public action became possible, and he did not easily accept the idea that a reformer should abandon it because one nomination had gone badly. There was calculation in that choice, but not calculation alone. Roosevelt feared that leaving the party would make reformers ornamental, admired perhaps by newspapers and drawing rooms, but detached from the machinery that actually governed. He also disliked the moral vanity he sometimes detected among men who preferred protest to power. This did not mean his critics were wrong about Blaine. It meant Roosevelt was already living inside the tension that would follow him for the rest of his career. He wanted clean government, but he wanted to win. He wanted independence, but he wanted party command. He wanted reform, but he did not want reform to become a beautiful form of defeat. That tension cost him some friendships and damaged his standing with certain reform circles, but it did not end his public career. Instead, it made him more complicated. The young assemblyman who had entered Albany with the certainty of a moral crusader left with a better understanding of how politics punished simplicity. He had seen corruption at close range, learned procedure, challenged machine habits, and discovered that even honorable men could divide over the method of honor. In the years ahead, grief would draw him away from this world for a time, but the lessons of Albany remained stored inside him. They remained because Albany had given him his first real education in power. Harvard had trained his mind, and illness had trained his will, but the assembly trained his political senses. It showed him that public virtue without leverage could become a speech, while leverage without virtue could become a racket. Roosevelt would spend much of his life trying to force those two facts into a workable relationship. For the moment, he was still young, still wounded only by political disappointment rather than private catastrophe, and still moving with the confidence of a man who believed the next contest would answer the last one. Chapter 4: Loss, Dakota, and the Making of a Public Myth. The day that divided Theodore Roosevelt's early life came with a cruelty so concentrated that even his later habit of movement could not make it ordinary. On February 14th, 1884, in the Roosevelt family house in New York, his mother, Martha Bullock Roosevelt, died of typhoid fever, and his young wife, Alice Hathaway Lee Roosevelt, died only hours later from kidney disease after giving birth to their daughter. Roosevelt was 25. The public man who would later speak so often, write so much, and turn almost every experience into usable language left only a small mark in his diary for that day. A large X crossed the page, followed by the words that the light had gone out of his life. Alice had given birth to their daughter 2 days before her death. The child, also named Alice, survived, but Roosevelt could not at first turn toward fatherhood with the tenderness that might have seemed natural from the outside. He was stunned by grief, and the infant was placed largely in the care of his sister Mamie, Anna Roosevelt Coles, who became one of the steady figures in the family's private arrangements. The fact is painful because it does not fit easily with the later image of Roosevelt as abundant and affectionate. Grief did not make him gentle in any simple way. It made him flee. Martha's death carried a different sorrow. She had been the graceful Southern presence in the household, the mother whose memories and family loyalties had helped give Roosevelt's childhood its divided Civil War atmosphere. Losing her on the same day as Alice joined childhood and marriage in one wound. His father had already died in 1878, and now two of the central affections of his life were gone within hours. The old family structure that had held him through illness, study, and ambition seemed suddenly emptied of its most intimate meanings. Roosevelt did not write much about Alice afterward. In later autobiographical writing, he passed over her almost entirely, as though memory itself had to be disciplined into silence. That silence has often been noticed because it differs so sharply from his usual abundance of words. He wrote books, letters, essays, speeches, reviews, and histories with tremendous energy, but around Alice there was restraint that bordered on erasure. It may have been his way of surviving a grief he could not use. Some losses could be made into action, and some had to be sealed away before action could resume. Dakota offered distance. Roosevelt had first gone west in 1883 to hunt bison, and like many Eastern men of means, he found in the cattle country a world that seemed to offer a harder test than city politics. After the deaths of 1884, the Dakota Territory became more than an adventure. It became a place where sorrow could be translated into exertion, risk, weather, property, and routine. There, in the country around the Little Missouri River, he invested in cattle operations and began to build the western chapter of his life. The Maltese Cross Ranch came first, before the more secluded Elkhorn Ranch followed. Elkhorn lay in the Badlands, far enough from the easier comforts of town to suit the mood of a man who wanted work, silence, and difficulty. The ranch house was made of cottonwood logs, with rooms, a broad porch, and the practical furnishings of a working frontier household rather than a gentleman's retreat. It was never poverty, and Roosevelt never ceased to be a wealthy Easterner. Still, the place required adaptation. Distance, heat, cold, dust, river crossings, and the care of animals did not soften themselves, because a man had gone to Harvard. Cattle ranching in the northern plains was not the romantic freedom that later memory sometimes made of it. It involved capital, grazing rights, branding, roundups, hired labor, markets, winter risk, and uncertain law. Roosevelt's money allowed him to enter quickly, but money did not teach him the country all at once. He needed partners and experienced hands, including men such as Bill Sewell and Wilmot Dow, who came from Maine and helped manage his interests. He also dealt with local ranchmen, hunters, cowboys, and officials whose respect could not be purchased in the same way land or cattle could. Theodore Roosevelt in Dakota became a figure both real and self-conscious. He wore frontier clothing, learned to ride more competently, hunted, joined roundups, and pressed himself into the routines of the cattle country. At first, some Western men regarded him as a curious tenderfoot with spectacles, refined speech, and Eastern assumptions. He was aware of being watched. His answer was usually to work harder than mockery expected. The method was familiar from childhood. A weakness or social disadvantage appeared, and he turned discipline toward it until the weakness lost some of its power. A small episode from the Dakota years shows the pattern clearly. Roosevelt once pursued men who had stolen his boat from the Elkhorn Ranch, traveling along the Little Missouri in cold conditions with his companions until the thieves were captured. He then guarded the prisoners and brought them back through the legal process rather than dealing with them through private frontier punishment. The story appealed to him because it joined endurance, courage, legality, and personal command. It also reveals something important about his Western identity. He admired rough men, but he did not believe roughness should stand above law. The Badlands gave Roosevelt material he would later use in books such as Hunting Trips of a Ranchman and Ranch Life and The Hunting Trail. These works helped turn his Western experience into public image. They were based on real episodes and real landscapes, but they also shaped the reader's understanding of Roosevelt himself. The East could see him not merely as a reforming assemblyman or grieving widower, but as a man who had tested himself in open country. The myth was being made while the experience was still fresh, and Roosevelt was one of its makers. There were genuine friendships in this period, though they crossed class lines unevenly. Roosevelt respected men who could ride, endure weather, handle animals, and keep their nerve without excessive speech. He could admire practical competence without pretending that social distinctions had disappeared. Ranch hands and local figures judged him by frontier standards, while he judged them through a mixture of affection, moral expectation, and literary interest. The result was not simple democracy, but it did widen his sense of American character beyond the parlors, clubs, and legislative rooms of the East. Law in the cattle country also interested him. The frontier was not lawless in the childish sense, but law could be thin, delayed, personal, and dependent on the willingness of local men to enforce it. Stock associations, brands, sheriffs, informal reputation, and courts all formed part of the order that allowed ranching to function. Roosevelt's later belief in strong public authority found reinforcement here. He did not come away believing that freedom meant the absence of government. He came away believing that order required men willing to defend law against both weakness and private violence. The environmental reality of the plains was harder than the myth. Cattle operators often assumed the open range could bear more animals than it could sustain, and a run of favorable years encouraged overconfidence. Then came the winter of 1886 1887. Severe cold, heavy snow, and the exhaustion of overstocked ranges devastated herds across the northern plains. Carcasses appeared when the thaw came, and investments that had seemed promising were reduced with brutal efficiency. Roosevelt lost much of what he had put into ranching, and the open range cattle boom entered a period from which it never fully returned in its earlier form. That winter mattered because it cut through illusion. Roosevelt had gone west partly to test himself against hardship, but the cattle disaster showed that hardship did not always ennoble or instruct in the way a moral story might promise. Weather could destroy effort without caring how bravely effort had been made. The market could punish misjudgment. Land could resist ambition. For a man who believed deeply in will, the plains gave a lesson in limits as well as strength. By 1887, Roosevelt's Dakota life had begun to recede as a permanent occupation, though not as memory. He returned increasingly to the East, remarried in 1886 to Edith Kermit Carew, and slowly rebuilt the domestic life that grief had interrupted. Edith had known him since childhood, and their marriage offered steadiness of a different kind from the brief, idealized happiness he had shared with Alice. Together they would build the household at Sagamore Hill, which became the family center for the rest of his life. The man who had run from one house of death began forming another house of continuity. Dakota remained with him because it gave him a usable past. It made him more credible when he spoke of strenuous life, more vivid when he wrote about American character, and more confident when he later presented himself as a national figure who understood more than Eastern privilege. Yet the truth beneath the public image was layered. He had been a grieving widower, a wealthy investor, a learning ranchman, a hunter, a writer, a local participant, and an outsider all at once. The West did not create Theodore Roosevelt from nothing. It gave him a harsher surface on which to carve the person he was already trying to become. When he moved back toward public life, he carried both the wound and the costume of those years. Alice's death remained mostly unspoken. Martha's memory folded into family history, and the Dakota country became one of the great reservoirs of his public identity. The young reformer who had learned Albany's machinery had now learned something of distance, animals, weather, law, men without polish, and loss without explanation. He had not escaped grief. He had given it work to do. Chapter 5: Reform Inside the City. New York City returned Theodore Roosevelt to a different kind of difficulty. Dakota had given him distance, weather, animals, and the plain tests of ranch work, but the city gave him crowds, offices, rules, contracts, newspapers, immigrants, police stations, and the older habits of municipal power. Its problems could not be met by riding farther or enduring more cold. They lay inside institutions, inside the habits of men who expected public service to bend toward private arrangement, and inside a city growing faster than its governing machinery could honestly manage. Roosevelt did not come back from the West as a finished national figure. He came back as a man with a stronger public image, a second marriage, literary work behind him, and an appetite for office that had not been diminished by grief or ranch failure. In 1886, he ran for mayor of New York City as the Republican candidate, entering a race that also included the United Labor candidate Henry George and the Democratic candidate Abram Hewitt. Roosevelt lost, finishing behind both men, but the campaign placed him again inside urban politics at a moment when class conflict, immigration, reform, and machine organization were all pressing against one another. The mayoral campaign taught him the limits of personal reputation in a city whose political loyalties were already deeply arranged. Henry George drew support from workers and reformers stirred by his arguments about poverty and land. Hewitt carried the democratic organization and the reassurance of established municipal competence. Roosevelt appealed to good government Republicans and to voters attracted by energy and honesty, but he could not make himself the central answer to New York's tensions. The defeat mattered less as an ending than as a reminder. In the city, moral urgency needed machinery of its own. Washington gave him that machinery in a quieter form. In 1889, President Benjamin Harrison appointed Roosevelt to the United States Civil Service Commission, where he served through Harrison's administration and into Grover Cleveland's second term. The commission's work did not offer the drama of campaigns, but it suited the reforming side of Roosevelt's mind. It dealt with examinations, appointments, classifications, dismissals, and the slow replacement of patronage with merit. For a man drawn to public contest, the work might have seemed small. Roosevelt treated it as a front line. Civil service reform rested on a simple principle that required stubborn enforcement. Government offices should not be treated as personal rewards for party workers. Clerks, inspectors, postal employees, and other public servants should be chosen according to fitness rather than favor. The Pendleton Act had already established a federal merit system after the assassination of President James Garfield, whose killer had been associated in public memory with the madness and grievance surrounding office seeking. Yet passing a law was not the same as changing a culture. Men who had lived by patronage did not surrender it merely because reformers had written new rules. Roosevelt's years on the commission gave him practice in a kind of politics that rarely produces statues. He investigated violations, argued with department heads, wrote reports, exposed evasions, and used publicity when quiet pressure failed. The work required attention to the ordinary channels through which corruption survived, an examination avoided, a temporary appointment extended, a classification manipulated, a local boss allowed to treat public employment as a party fund. Each case could look minor from a distance. Together they formed the daily face of government, and the spoils system taught citizens that loyalty could matter more than merit. There was a procedural satisfaction in this work. A rule had to be written clearly. A test had to be administered fairly. A department had to be asked why one man had been favored over another. Documents had to be examined, and evasions had to be made visible enough that newspapers and honest officials could not ignore them. Roosevelt liked the public side of such confrontations, but he also respected the paper trail. Reform, at this level, moved through files before it moved through speeches. His service under both a Republican and a Democratic president also strengthened his claim that reform stood above party convenience. This did not mean he had become nonpartisan. Roosevelt remained a Republican, and he never lost the instinct that party was the necessary vessel of action. But on the Civil Service Commission, he could present himself as an officer of clean administration rather than a mere party combatant. That position gave him moral authority, and he used it with little fear of annoying men who preferred reform to remain polite. Jacob Riis entered Roosevelt's life through another doorway into the city. Riis, a Danish born journalist and reformer, had documented the conditions of New York's tenements in How the Other Half Lives, published in 1890. His work used reporting, photography, and moral appeal to force comfortable readers to look at the crowded housing, lodging houses, alleys, and immigrant poverty that polite society often preferred to keep at a distance. Roosevelt admired Riis because Riis offered knowledge of the city that was not theoretical. He had walked its streets, entered its rooms, spoken with its poor, and brought back evidence. The friendship between Roosevelt and Riis mattered because it joined two different forms of reform energy. Roosevelt had office, family name, political access, and a belief in public discipline. Riis had first-hand urban knowledge, immigrant sympathy, and the authority of a witness who had seen what he described. Roosevelt later called him the best American he ever knew, a phrase that reveals both affection and a certain need. Riis helped Roosevelt feel that his reforming instincts were connected to actual human conditions rather than merely administrative ideals. In 1895, Roosevelt became president of the New York City Board of Police Commissioners. The position placed him inside one of the most troubled institutions in the city. Police corruption was not a rumor kept alive only by reformers. It was tied to saloons, gambling, prostitution, political protection, bribery, selective enforcement, and the ordinary bargains through which a city's unofficial life purchased room to operate. Officers worked under rules, but they also worked under expectations shaped by ward politics and local arrangements. To reform the police was to disturb many forms of income and influence at once. Roosevelt approached the board with characteristic publicity. He wanted rules enforced, officers disciplined, promotions made more honestly, and Sunday closing laws applied to saloons. That last effort brought him into conflict not only with corrupt interests, but with working class habits and immigrant social life. For many laboring men, Sunday was the one day available for sociability, and saloons were not merely places of drink. They were neighborhood centers, employment exchanges, political spaces, and shelters of familiarity in a crowded city. Roosevelt's moral and legal clarity did not always capture that social texture. Late night inspections became the most remembered feature of his police work. With Riis and others, Roosevelt went out after midnight to see whether officers were at their posts or asleep, absent or neglecting duty. The image was irresistible to newspapers. The energetic commissioner moving through the darkened city, appearing where no one expected him. Yet beneath the image was an institutional method. Roosevelt knew that a rule ignored after midnight was not really a rule. The inspection made authority visible at the hour when routine expected invisibility. One night's inspection could reveal the practical weakness of a whole department. An officer missing from a post meant more than one man's failure. It suggested supervision too loose, discipline too negotiable, and local confidence that no superior would appear. Roosevelt understood the symbolic value of showing up. His presence turned the distant board into something immediate, and officers who had treated rules as abstractions had to consider that inspection might come personally, inconveniently, and without warning. The work brought admiration and resentment in nearly equal measure. Reform newspapers praised him, political enemies mocked him. Saloon keepers and their defenders accused him of attacking ordinary pleasures, while wealthy clubs escaped the same scrutiny. Police officers could regard him as a meddling outsider who did not understand the daily realities of the beat. Some criticism was self interested, but some pointed toward a real limitation in Roosevelt's temperament. He was often better at enforcing a principle than at noticing when the principle fell unevenly across social classes. That limitation did not make his police work meaningless. He helped establish higher expectations for discipline, appointments, and public scrutiny. He showed that a city department could be treated as a moral and administrative object rather than a private preserve. His tenure was not long enough to remake the New York police, and no single commissioner could have done so. But he left behind an example of reform as presence, reading the rules, walking the streets, confronting the officers, taking the criticism, and making evasion more difficult than it had been. The police years also sharpened Roosevelt's understanding of publicity as a governing tool. Newspapers could punish a reformer, but they could also multiply his reach. A midnight inspection mattered more when the public read about it. A disciplinary fight mattered more when citizens could see that someone had named the abuse. Roosevelt did not shrink from this arrangement. He understood, earlier than many politicians, that modern reform needed visibility. In a mass city, virtue hidden in an office could not compete with corruption embedded in habit. New York's immigrant neighborhoods complicated him. Roosevelt could admire effort, family loyalty, military service, and civic assimilation, yet he often interpreted difference through the expectations of his own class and nationalism. His sympathy was real, but it usually came with demands. He wanted newcomers to become Americans in language, loyalty, and public spirit. He respected hardship when it seemed to produce strength, but he had less patience for customs that appear to resist the common civic mold he believed the country required. Still, the city enlarged him. It forced him to move beyond the moral simplicity of condemning machine politics from above. Reform in New York meant dealing with hunger, housing, drink, policing, ethnic politics, employment, and the daily compromises of people who did not live by the codes of Harvard clubs or reform associations. Rees helped him see some of this, though not all of it. The police board exposed the difference between clean administration on paper and clean administration in a living city. Each lesson made Roosevelt more prepared for national office because the nation itself was becoming more urban, industrial, and administratively complex. By the time he left the police board in 1897 to become Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President William McKinley, Roosevelt had passed through several schools of public life. Albany had taught him the machine. Dakota had taught him the power and danger of public myth. The Civil Service Commission had taught him the value of rules honestly enforced. New York policing had taught him that institutions changed only when pressure reached the place where habit lived. He still loved action more than patience and publicity more than anonymity, but he had learned that action could be administrative as well as physical. The next arena suited another side of him. The Navy Department offered ships, strategy, preparedness, and the prospect that the United States might soon act beyond its own shores. Roosevelt had spent years fighting corruption inside offices and cities. Now he moved toward a world where national power, military readiness, and public ambition would meet, and where his own hunger for a larger test would find the event that carried him upward faster than reform alone could have done. Chapter 6: The War That Carried Him Upward. The Navy Department gave Theodore Roosevelt a desk, but it did not give him stillness. When President William McKinley's administration appointed him Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1897, Roosevelt entered an office that matched several of his oldest interests at once: history, preparedness, command, ships, national honor, and the uses of power beyond the shoreline. He had written about the Naval War of 1812 while still a young man, and that early study had convinced him that weakness at sea could become weakness in national destiny. A country that meant to matter in the modern world, he believed, needed more than prosperity and good intentions. It needed ships, trained men, clear plans, and the political will to use them. Roosevelt was not the head of the Navy Department. That position belonged to Secretary John D. Long, a more cautious and restrained public servant whose temperament differed sharply from his assistant's. Long valued order and balance, while Roosevelt pressed forward with a restless conviction that events were moving faster than official Washington wanted to admit. Spain still held Cuba, where rebellion, repression, and American sympathy had drawn the island into United States politics. Newspapers followed the conflict closely. Cuban suffering stirred public emotion, and expansionist voices argued that American power had a duty, an interest, or both in the Caribbean. Roosevelt saw in the crisis not only a humanitarian question, but a test of national readiness. The Navy he entered was stronger than it had once been, but still in the middle of transformation. Steel ships, modern guns, coaling stations, and strategic thinking were changing the meaning of sea power. Alfred Thayer Mahan's arguments about navies and empire had already influenced men who believed that the United States could not remain content with continental security alone. Roosevelt admired Mahan and shared much of his worldview. To him, ships were not merely instruments of defense. They were statements of national seriousness, and the absence of readiness invited humiliation. In office, Roosevelt attended to practical things because practical things made policy real. Ships had to be supplied, squadrons had to be positioned, officers had to be chosen with care. Ammunition, coal, repairs, and orders mattered more than speeches once war approached. One of the most famous moments of his assistant secretaryship came when Secretary Long was away from the department, and Roosevelt helped send instructions that prepared Commodore George Dewey's Asiatic Squadron for possible action against Spain in the Philippines. The order did not create the war, but it showed Roosevelt's habit of treating a possible crisis as something to be prepared for before the official hour arrived. McKinley moved more cautiously. The president had served in the Civil War and did not romanticize armed conflict in the same way younger men often did. He understood the political pressure for war, but he also knew that war, once begun, carried consequences beyond the first surge of public feeling. The destruction of the battleship USS Maine in Havana Harbor in February 1898 intensified the crisis. The cause of the explosion was not settled at the time, and later debate would remain, but the political effect was immediate. Public anger grew, newspapers sharpened it, and the space for delay narrowed. Roosevelt was among those who believed war with Spain had become both likely and desirable. His confidence had several roots. He wanted Cuba free from Spanish rule. He wanted the United States to show vigor, and he believed national character could be strengthened through trial. This last belief is one of the more revealing parts of his public mind. He did not welcome suffering for its own sake, but he feared softness, drift, and excessive caution. Peace, if it became merely comfortable, seemed to him capable of weakening the moral fiber of a people. It was an idea that carried courage inside it, and danger as well. When war came in April 1898, Roosevelt did something rare for a man holding an important Washington post. He resigned. The decision was both sincere and perfectly suited to the public image he had been building for years. He did not want only to prepare others for war. He wanted to take part in it himself. Alongside Leonard Wood, an Army surgeon and Medal of Honor recipient from earlier frontier service, he helped organize the first United States Volunteer Cavalry. The regiment quickly became known as the Rough Riders, a name that carried the Western energy Roosevelt had cultivated in Dakota and now brought onto the national stage. The regiment's composition gave it symbolic power before it had done anything militarily decisive. It included men from the Southwest and the Plains, cowboys, hunters, miners, lawmen, native men from Indian Territory, and athletes from Eastern colleges. The mixture was not as socially equal as legend sometimes made it, but it was vivid. Roosevelt understood what the image offered: a union of East and West, privilege and rough skill, discipline and volunteer enthusiasm. In one regiment, the country could imagine itself as vigorous, varied, masculine, and ready. Training and transport were less romantic. The Rough Riders gathered at camps where equipment, horses, uniforms, weapons, and orders had to be sorted under the pressure of haste. The Army was not fully prepared for the sudden demands of overseas war, and confusion followed the volunteers from assembly to embarkation. At Tampa, delays and crowding made the movement toward Cuba disorderly. Many horses did not make the journey, which meant that a volunteer cavalry regiment would fight largely on foot. Such details rarely survive as strongly as battlefield names, but they shaped the actual experience of the campaign. Cuba offered heat, rain, mud, disease, uncertain maps, and tangled command arrangements. The American forces landed near Santiago, where Spanish defenses and the geography around the city created a difficult field of operations. Major General William Shafter commanded the expedition, while figures such as Joseph Wheeler, a former Confederate cavalry general now serving the United States, gave the campaign an unusual Civil War afterlife. Roosevelt, serving under Leonard Wood at first, and then rising in command as Wood moved upward, found himself in the kind of situation he had long imagined: public danger, visible responsibility, and the chance to turn preparation into reputation. The fight at Las Guasimas came before the more famous action around San Juan Heights. Reports from the campaign could be confused, and later memory often cleaned up what the moment itself made untidy. Roosevelt and the Rough Riders performed with courage, but the campaign was not a story of one regiment alone. Regular Army units, black soldiers of the Ninth and 10th Cavalry, artillerymen, officers, scouts, and Cuban forces all belonged to the larger military picture. Roosevelt praised some of these men, though the racial assumptions of his age and his own views shaped how recognition was distributed. The memory of the war would lift him higher than it lifted many who had shared its risks. San Juan Heights became the central public scene. The American advance on July 1st, 1898, involved movement against Spanish positions near Santiago, including Kettle Hill and the San Juan Heights beyond it. Roosevelt's Rough Riders were part of the action at Kettle Hill, alongside regulars whose contribution later received less popular attention. The physical facts of the fight were difficult and costly, but the historical significance for Roosevelt lay in the outcome and the image it produced. He had been under fire, had helped lead men forward, and had emerged with a story that newspapers could understand at once. That story did not make itself. Roosevelt wrote, spoke, corrected, remembered, and shaped the account of his war service with characteristic energy. He admired bravery in others, but he also knew the value of being seen as brave. War condensed his public identity. The sickly child had become a mounted volunteer commander. The reformer had become a soldier. The Dakota ranchman had found a national battlefield, and the writer had been given material that required almost no decoration to be politically powerful. There was genuine courage in it. There was also a remarkable instinct for the uses of courage in public life. The campaign's less glorious realities followed quickly. Disease caused more suffering than enemy fire, and American camps became places of fever, weakness, and administrative strain. Roosevelt joined other officers in pressing for the troops to be brought home from Cuba before illness consumed them further. The so-called round-robin letter, signed by officers and made public, criticized the conditions and urged removal from the island. It embarrassed the War Department, but it also helped draw attention to the dangers facing the Army after the main fighting had passed. Roosevelt again stood at the junction of action, publicity, and pressure on authority. Spain's defeat came swiftly. The war lasted only a few months, but its consequences reached far beyond Cuba. The United States emerged with new overseas possessions, including Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, while Cuba entered a different and constrained relationship with American power. Dewey's victory at Manila Bay, prepared in part by those earlier naval orders, had opened an Asian dimension to the conflict that many Americans had not fully imagined when public attention centered on Cuba. Roosevelt saw the war as confirmation that readiness and boldness could change a nation's position in the world. Others would see the same events as the beginning of an American empire that carried its own moral burdens. For Roosevelt personally, the war did what no municipal office or commission appointment could have done so quickly. It made him a national figure. Newspapers loved the Rough Riders, and Roosevelt's name traveled with the regiment's story. His face, spectacles, teeth, uniform, and Western association became part of a recognizable public image. The transformation from reform politician to war hero did not erase his earlier work, but it gave that work a new force. A man who had fought patronage and inspected police posts could now also claim the authority of command under fire. The timing mattered. New York Republicans needed a strong candidate for governor in 1898, and Roosevelt's fame made him difficult to ignore. Party leaders who might once have regarded him as troublesome now had to weigh his popularity against his independence. Thomas C. Platt, the powerful Republican boss in New York, understood both the opportunity and the risk. Roosevelt could win votes, especially after the war, but he could also disturb arrangements that bosses preferred to manage without public interference. The old problem returned in a larger form. Roosevelt was useful because he was famous for not being easily controlled. His own ambitions were not hidden from himself. He believed he had served honorably, and he believed public office should follow public service. The governorship of New York offered a field large enough for reform, visible enough for national attention, and difficult enough to satisfy his appetite for contest. Yet the road to Albany now passed through a different gate than before. He was no longer merely the young assemblyman with reform convictions. He was Colonel Roosevelt of the Rough Riders, and that title carried a music the public understood. War had carried him upward because it joined the elements of his life into a single public form. The discipline built against childhood illness, the Western image formed in Dakota, the reformer's appetite for action, the historian's belief in preparedness, and the nationalist's faith in vigor all came together in 1898. The result was not the whole Theodore Roosevelt, but it was the version of him that could move fastest through American politics. From that point onward, every office he entered would receive him not only as a politician, but as a man already surrounded by legend. Chapter 7: Albany, Washington, and the Accidental Presidency. The governorship of New York placed Theodore Roosevelt inside the largest political arena he had yet entered, and it did so at the exact moment when his fame made him both valuable and inconvenient. In 1898, he returned from Cuba as Colonel Roosevelt of the Rough Riders, a title that carried the smell of powder and horse leather in the public imagination, even when the actual campaign had been shorter, messier, and more crowded with other men's service than legend allowed. Republican leaders in New York understood that his name could draw voters after the Spanish-American War. They also understood that the same public reputation might make him difficult to manage once he reached Albany. Thomas C. Platt understood that problem more clearly than most. Platt, the Republican boss of New York, had spent years in the practical world of appointments, favors, nominations, and party discipline. He did not need to dislike Roosevelt in order to distrust him. Roosevelt was popular, energetic, and identified with reform. He also belonged to a type of politician who could accept party support while refusing to behave like a party instrument. To a boss, that combination was not reassuring. A popular reformer could be useful at election time and troublesome every day afterward. Roosevelt's nomination for governor therefore carried a bargain that neither side fully controlled. The Republican organization needed his war fame, and Roosevelt needed the organization's machinery. New York was not won by admiration alone. Campaigns required county leaders, money, newspapers, local workers, and careful attention to the ethnic, religious, and regional differences inside the state. Roosevelt could speak the language of public virtue, but he also knew by now that politics was not conducted from a clean height above organization. He had learned that lesson in the assembly, and he had not forgotten it. The election was close enough to remind him that fame had limits. Roosevelt defeated the Democrat Augustus Van Wyck, but not by a margin that allowed him to pretend the machine had been unnecessary. Once in office, he moved with the confidence of a man who believed he had earned his position through courage and public trust. Yet he was surrounded by men who believed the governorship belonged partly to the party structure that had carried him there. That difference shaped his time in Albany. Roosevelt did not govern as an enemy of the Republican Party. He governed as a Republican who thought the party should be made more honorable by his use of it. The governor's office gave him authority over appointments, legislation, and public advocacy, but it also gave him daily contact with compromise. Civil service reform remained important to him. Taxation, corporate power, labor conditions, and state administration all demanded attention. New York was industrial, urban, rural, wealthy, immigrant, and politically dense, a state large enough to contain many of the national issues that would later define his presidency. In Albany, Roosevelt could test ideas that were not yet fully presidential in scale, but already pointed toward a broader use of executive power. Franchise taxation became one of the central issues of his governorship. Street railway, gas, electric, and other corporations used public rights of way that carried enormous value, and reformers argued that such privileges should be taxed more fairly. Senator Thomas C. Platt and corporation-friendly interests did not welcome aggressive action. Roosevelt supported a franchise tax measure, and the fight revealed the kind of line he was willing to draw. He did not oppose corporations merely because they were large. He opposed the idea that private interests could draw profit from public grants while escaping public obligation. This was not yet the fully developed square deal, but the outline was visible. Roosevelt believed property should be protected, but he also believed public authority had the right to discipline property when privilege hardened into unfair advantage. The view placed him between older laissez-faire habits and more radical attacks on capital. It also gave him a political language that could appeal to citizens uneasy about concentrated wealth, but not ready to condemn enterprise itself. Albany sharpened that middle position because the state's corporations were close enough to be named and powerful enough to resist. Platt watched all this with increasing concern. The boss had not expected Roosevelt to become docile, but the governor's independence threatened the settled relationship between party organization and state power. Roosevelt consulted Platt at times and did not treat him as irrelevant, yet consultation did not mean obedience. The two men belonged to different political ages. Platt represented the disciplined machine that had grown out of 19th century party politics. Roosevelt represented the coming politics of personality, publicity, reform language, and executive initiative. For a time, they had to occupy the same party. The miniature of this tension can be found in the ordinary business of appointments. A boss measured power partly by the ability to recommend men for office, reward loyalty, and maintain the chain of obligation that held the organization together. Roosevelt measured public office through efficiency, character, and his own judgment of fitness. When he resisted machine choices, he was not merely disagreeing over names. He was challenging a social structure of politics in which loyalty moved through jobs. A single appointment could carry the weight of a larger argument about what government was for. National Republicans began to see a way to remove the difficulty without destroying the asset. The vice presidency in 1900 offered Roosevelt honor, visibility, and apparent elevation, while taking him out of Albany and placing him in an office with almost no daily power. President William McKinley was running for a second term, and his first vice president, Garrett Hobart, had died in 1899. The ticket needed a new running mate. Roosevelt's war fame, reform reputation, and popularity in New York made him attractive. To Platt and other managers, the office also seemed to solve the problem of having him too close to the levers of state government. Mark Hanna, McKinley's powerful advisor and campaign manager, did not share the comfort of that solution. Hanna understood that the vice presidency was powerless only as long as the president lived. He reportedly had little desire to see Roosevelt placed a heartbeat from the presidency, and his anxiety has echoed through nearly every account of the nomination. It was a practical fear, not a mystical one. Hanna knew Roosevelt was not a ceremonial man. If accident raised him higher, he would not treat the presidency as a chair to be occupied cautiously. Roosevelt himself had mixed feelings. The vice presidency could be a political tomb, and ambitious men knew it. It offered presiding authority over the Senate, occasional speeches, and public standing, but little direct control over policy. For someone who loved action, it risked becoming a beautifully upholstered form of confinement. Yet refusal was difficult. The pressure from party leaders was strong, the honor was real, and the national stage appealed to him. He accepted the nomination, and the Republican convention made him McKinley's running mate. The campaign of 1900 placed Roosevelt before national audiences, as few previous vice presidential candidates had been placed. He traveled widely, spoke forcefully, defended the administration, praised national expansion, and attacked William Jennings Bryan and the Democrats. The recent war, the debate over empire, prosperity, currency, and America's place in the world shaped the campaign's public atmosphere. Roosevelt was useful because he embodied the strenuous nationalism that Republicans wanted to claim without making McKinley himself appear reckless. He could carry the sharper edge while McKinley remained calm and presidential. The Republican victory gave Roosevelt the office, but not the work he desired. As vice president, he found himself in a constitutional position whose dignity exceeded its practical duties. Presiding over the Senate required patience, restraint, and attention to procedure. It did not allow him to direct reform, command departments, or shape national policy with the immediacy he preferred. He continued speaking and writing, continued cultivating relationships, and continued watching the nation's affairs from a place near power, but not inside its active machinery. For Roosevelt, nearness without action was its own discomfort. In September 1901, President McKinley traveled to Buffalo for the Pan American Exposition. The exposition itself represented a confident America, electrical display, industrial achievement, hemispheric commerce, and the self-assurance of a nation that had recently emerged from war with new overseas reach. McKinley greeted the public in a receiving line at the Temple of Music on September 6. Leon Sulgos, an anarchist, approached with a concealed weapon and shot him. The physical details do not need lingering over. The result was enough. The President of the United States lay wounded, and the question of succession moved from constitutional theory into the life of Theodore Roosevelt. At first, McKinley seemed likely to recover. Roosevelt, who had gone to Buffalo, then left after encouraging reports and traveled into the Adirondacks. The decision was not careless by the standards of the information available to him. Doctors and officials believed the danger had eased. Then McKinley's condition worsened. Messages moved through the mountains, and Roosevelt had to be reached at a remote camp near Mount Marcy. The scene has endured because it contained the old elements of distance and urgency. A vice president away from the capital, a wounded president declining, and riders carrying news through rough country until succession could be brought back into motion. Roosevelt traveled through the night toward Buffalo. By the time he arrived, McKinley was dead. On September 14, 1901, in the home of Ansley Wilcox, Theodore Roosevelt took the oath of office as President of the United States. He was 42 years old, the youngest person ever to become president. There was no election victory of his own behind the moment, no long-prepared transition, no carefully chosen cabinet assembled for his purposes. The office came to him through murder, illness, message, travel, and constitutional necessity. The oath did not make him triumphant. Those present remembered a controlled and solemn Roosevelt, aware that the nation had lost a president and that his own arrival could not appear eager. He pledged to continue McKinley's policies, a statement meant to reassure the cabinet, the party, the markets, and a shocked public. Continuity mattered in that room. The man whom bosses had lifted into the vice presidency to contain him now had to convince the country that he would not disturb everything at once. Yet containment had failed completely. Platt's solution, Hanna's fear, and Roosevelt's frustrated vice presidency all converged in the same small Buffalo house. The office that had seemed ceremonial now opened into power broader than any Roosevelt had held. He inherited McKinley's cabinet, McKinley's party, McKinley's recent imperial responsibilities, and McKinley's national grief. But he brought into that inheritance his own long preparation, childhood discipline, Albany reform, Dakota self-making, police inspections, naval readiness, war fame, and a governorship spent testing public authority against private influence. America at the turn of the century was ready for such a figure in ways it did not fully understand. Industrial capitalism had grown faster than older laws. Cities had expanded faster than older habits of government. The United States had stepped beyond continental power into Caribbean and Pacific responsibilities. Labor conflict, corporate concentration, race, immigration, conservation, and imperial policy all pressed against the presidency. Roosevelt did not create these pressures. He arrived at the office when they were already demanding a president willing to make the executive branch more visible. The accidental president was therefore not an accidental force. The path to the White House had been irregular, and the final step had come through tragedy, But Roosevelt had spent nearly 2 decades training himself for public struggle. He knew legislatures, commissions, city departments, state government, campaigns, war publicity, and party management. He understood the press. He understood the uses of moral language. He understood that attention could be a form of power. Now, for the first time, he held an office large enough for the full scale of his temperament. Chapter 8. The Square Deal Takes Shape. The presidency reached Theodore Roosevelt through violence, but he understood at once that his first task was steadiness. In September 1901, the country had not chosen him directly for the office he now held, and many Republicans still thought of him as the energetic man placed on the ticket for usefulness rather than trust. Business leaders wondered whether he would disturb the confidence that had grown under William McKinley. Party managers wondered whether he would consult or command. Cabinet officers watched to see whether the new president would merely inherit an administration or begin bending it toward himself. Roosevelt answered first with continuity. He asked McKinley's cabinet to remain, promised to carry forward the policies of the previous administration, and made public reassurance part of the transfer of power. The gesture was politically necessary, but it did not mean passivity. Roosevelt could keep a cabinet in place and still change the atmosphere around the presidency. His presence altered the office before policy had fully shifted. The White House became more audible, more personal, more immediate, and more willing to act as the visible center of national argument. At 42, Roosevelt brought a different physical and verbal energy into presidential life. Visitors noticed the quick movement, the stream of talk, the sudden turns from policy to books, to birds, to war, to family matters, and the sense that the office had been occupied by a man who could not bear dead space. Yet the important change was not merely temperament. Roosevelt believed the president had a duty to speak for the public interest when older institutions moved too slowly or served interests too narrow. The office in his hands would not wait politely at the edge of conflict. The phrase that came to gather much of this approach was the square deal. It did not begin as a complete program written all at once, and it did not mean equality in the modern sense. Roosevelt believed in hierarchy, property, discipline, and social order. He did not imagine government as a weapon against wealth as such. What he did insist upon was that labor, capital, and the public should all stand under a higher rule of fairness, and that the national government could intervene when private power threatened the common welfare. This position gave him room to move between extremes. To conservative businessmen, he could say that he was protecting property by saving it from its own excesses. To workers and reformers, he could say that public authority would no longer pretend that great corporations were private matters only. To the Republican Party, he could present reform as a way to preserve order rather than overturn it. Roosevelt often thought in moral categories, but his politics here were practical. A society that refused every reform he believed invited something harsher than reform. The White House dinner with Booker T. Washington in October 1901 revealed both the reach and the limits of Roosevelt's instincts. Washington, the founder of Tuskegee Institute and the most prominent black leader in America at the time, came to the White House to discuss Southern appointments and race relations. Roosevelt then invited him to dine. In the formal etiquette of the presidency, The invitation carried meaning beyond ordinary hospitality. It placed a black man at the president's table in a country where segregation, disfranchisement, lynching, and racial terror defined much of public life for African Americans, especially in the South. The reaction was immediate and bitter among many white Southern politicians and newspapers. Roosevelt had not intended the dinner as a broad social revolution, and in later handling he showed caution when faced with the scale of the backlash. Still, the event mattered because it exposed the racial boundaries of national politics. A dinner that should have been a simple courtesy became, in the eyes of many critics, an intolerable breach. Washington himself understood both the honor and the danger of the moment. He had built his public strategy around industrial education, accommodation, institution building, and careful negotiation with white power, and even that cautious approach did not protect him from rage when the etiquette of racial hierarchy was disturbed. Roosevelt's record on race would remain uneven. He could show personal respect to individual black leaders and appoint some black men to office, yet he also shared many racial assumptions common among white Americans of his time, and he did not make racial justice a sustained governing priority. Later, in the Brownsville Affair of 1906, his decision to discharge black soldiers without honor after accusations in Texas would stand as one of the harshest racial acts of his presidency. The Washington dinner, therefore, should not be softened into a simple emblem of equality. It was a real breach in custom, and it was also surrounded by limits that Roosevelt did not overcome. Corporate power presented a different kind of test, one more directly suited to the square deal that was beginning to form. The late 19th century had produced combinations of capital whose scale unsettled older ideas of competition. Railroads, oil, steel, finance, and industrial trusts crossed state lines and shaped prices, labor conditions, transportation, and political influence. Many Americans felt that large corporations had become too powerful, but there was no single agreement about what should be done. Some wanted regulation, some wanted dissolution, some wanted government to stay away. Some feared socialism more than monopoly and therefore tolerated abuses they disliked. Roosevelt did not enter office as an enemy of big business. He admired efficiency, organization, and productive force. In that respect, he differed from reformers who saw size itself as the central evil. To him, the real question was whether corporate power served a legitimate economic purpose under public supervision, or whether it became arrogant, secretive, and irresponsible. The distinction allowed him to speak against bad trusts while leaving room for large combinations he believed could be managed. It also placed the president in the role of judge, a role Roosevelt accepted with little reluctance. J.P. Morgan and other financial leaders soon had to learn that the new president's language was not decorative. Roosevelt wanted information, publicity, and the authority to distinguish between acceptable and dangerous corporate behavior. The Bureau of Corporations, later established within the Department of Commerce and Labor, would become part of this method. Investigation mattered because Roosevelt believed the public could not govern what it could not see. Hidden arrangements gave private power an advantage over democratic judgment. Reports, documents, figures, and federal inquiry could make that advantage less secure. Labor also pressed into the early presidency. Industrial growth had given the United States remarkable wealth, but the distribution of risk and reward remained deeply uneven. Workers faced long hours, dangerous conditions, uncertain wages, and limited bargaining power, while employers often treated unions as threats to property and order. Roosevelt did not become a labor radical. He distrusted class warfare and disliked rhetoric that seemed to divide the nation into permanent enemies. Yet he also rejected the idea that employers alone represented order, while workers represented disturbance. A strike could threaten the public, but so could an owner's refusal to consider public need. This was where Roosevelt's idea of arbitration gained importance. He liked the role of mediator partly because it suited his self-image as a man above narrow interests, but it also answered a real structural problem. Industrial conflict could no longer be treated as a local quarrel when railroads, mines, factories, and fuel supplies affected millions. The federal government had long acted to protect property and suppress disorder. Roosevelt began moving toward a presidency that could also pressure owners, recognize labor's grievances, and claim the public as a third party in disputes that private men wished to keep private. The press became one of his chief instruments. Roosevelt had known publicity since his assembly days, police inspections, Rough Rider fame, and campaign tours, but the presidency gave him a larger stage. Reporters found him irresistible because he gave them motion, phrases, access, and conflict. He understood that newspapers could carry presidential pressure into places where formal authority moved slowly. A speech could frame a dispute before legislation existed. A public letter could make an opponent defensive. A carefully placed phrase could give citizens a way to understand a policy before the policy had hardened into law. The White House itself became more active as a social and political space. Roosevelt's children brought a visible family life into the executive mansion, and their presence gave the public a domestic image of the president that differed from the solemn distance of older political culture. Alice Roosevelt, his daughter from his first marriage, became especially famous for her wit, independence, and social visibility. Edith Roosevelt managed the household with discipline and privacy, offering a counterweight to the public exuberance around her husband. The family did not create the square deal, but it helped make the presidency feel more immediate to the country watching it. Inside the administration, Roosevelt worked through men who could translate energy into policy. George Courteau, first as secretary to the president and later in cabinet office, represented the administrative competence Roosevelt needed. Elihu Root, John Hay, Philander Knox, and others gave his government legal, diplomatic, and political weight. Roosevelt liked strong men around him, but he also wanted final direction to rest with the president. The cabinet was not merely a circle of independent department chiefs. Increasingly, under Roosevelt, it became part of an executive operation centered on the White House. His moral vocabulary could make this centralization sound almost simple, but the machinery beneath it was complicated. The president had to deal with Congress, courts, parties, newspapers, business leaders, reformers, diplomats, and local interests. He could not merely declare a square deal and have the nation rearrange itself. Legislation took time. Court cases carried uncertainty. Party allies had their own limits. Conservative Republicans watched him carefully, while progressive reformers wanted more than he was often prepared to give. Roosevelt's talent lay in making partial measures feel like part of a larger movement. That larger movement was still forming in the early years of his presidency. The name Square Deal would gather policies around itself, but the underlying principle appeared first through posture. The president would be visible, national, morally assertive, and willing to pressure powerful interests in the name of the public. He would not accept the older idea that government should step aside whenever wealth claimed efficiency or whenever labor conflict embarrassed polite society. Nor would he accept a politics that treated protest as virtue by itself. He wanted order, but order disciplined by fairness. There was danger in this confidence. A president who claimed to speak for the public could also mistake his own judgment for the public good. Roosevelt's certainty made him effective, and at times it made him impatient with opposition that deserved a hearing. He trusted action more than delay and character more than systems, even while building systems that outlasted him. The tension was central to his presidency. He strengthened public authority because he believed the republic needed it, but he often imagined that authority most vividly when it passed through a forceful executive will. By the time the Square Deal began taking shape, Roosevelt had already changed the emotional temperature of American government. Citizens who feared corporate domination could look to the White House with new expectation. Business leaders who had grown used to private access now faced a president willing to investigate and expose. Workers saw that the federal government might not always stand automatically with employers. Reformers saw possibility, while conservatives saw danger. The office had become a place where national conflicts arrived earlier, spoke louder, and demanded a presidential answer. The next tests would give that answer sharper form. Corporate consolidation would move from general concern to legal confrontation. Coal would move from private industry to public necessity when winter approached and miners remained out. Roosevelt's words about fairness would have to pass through courts, conference rooms, owners, unions, households, and the hard question of how far a president could go when no one had clearly shown the way. Chapter 9: Trusts, Coal, and the Power of the Office. Coal gave Theodore Roosevelt's presidency one of its clearest tests because it turned an industrial dispute into a national discomfort that ordinary people could feel in their own houses. The mines of eastern Pennsylvania did not seem, at first glance, like a natural extension of the White House. They belonged to companies, investors, railroad interests, managers, engineers, miners, and union organizers, all of them tied to a specific region and a specific industry. Yet anthracite coal heated homes, powered businesses, and carried winter itself into the calculations of national politics. When the mines stopped, private conflict became public necessity. The strike began in May 1902 when anthracite miners under the leadership of John Mitchell and the United Mine Workers pressed for higher wages, shorter hours, and recognition of their union. The men worked in a hard and dangerous industry, often under company systems that shaped not only wages, but housing, stores, local authority, and family security. The mine operators, led by figures such as George F. Baer, refused to recognize the union and treated the dispute as a matter of property and managerial authority. To them, Federal involvement seemed improper. To Roosevelt, that answer became less satisfying as the stoppage continued. At first, the president had no clear legal path. The federal government could intervene in certain kinds of disorder, and it could act when interstate commerce or federal law gave it an opening, but no president had a well-established power to summon owners and union leaders simply because a labor dispute threatened the public. Roosevelt understood the gap. He also understood that the public might not care about the legal neatness of the problem if winter came and coal bins were empty. Authority, in this case, had to be improvised within the boundaries of law, pressure, and public expectation. The coal fields themselves were not abstractions in the lives of the miners. Anthracite mining required men and boys to enter a world of shafts, breakers, dust, lamps, carts, and company discipline. Wages could be uncertain because work depended on conditions underground and on systems of measurement controlled by the companies. Families lived near the mines, and ethnic communities from Ireland, Wales, Poland, Slovakia, Italy, Lithuania, and other places formed part of the social world of the coal region. The strike therefore joined labor organization to immigrant life, household survival, and the older American fear that concentrated ownership could make working men politically powerless. Roosevelt did not approach the strike as a socialist, a Union partisan, or an enemy of capital. He believed in property. He distrusted class hatred. He also disliked the arrogance with which some owners assumed that their legal rights ended the question. George Baer famously suggested that the rights and interests of laboring men would be protected by Christian men to whom God had given control of property. The sentence was damaging because it made paternalism sound not merely old-fashioned, but almost feudal. Roosevelt saw that such language placed the operators on the wrong side of public feeling. John Mitchell offered a different public figure. He was calm, careful, and disciplined, a labor leader who understood that the miners' cause would suffer if it appeared violent or reckless. Mitchell's manner helped Roosevelt treat the Union as a responsible party rather than as a mob outside the political order. This mattered. If labor could present itself as orderly, articulate, and connected to public need, then the president had more room to press the owners without appearing to surrender the government to disorder. Mitchell's restraint became one of the quiet strengths of the miners' position. In October 1902, Roosevelt summoned both sides to Washington. The meeting was extraordinary because the president was not merely receiving information. He was placing the moral pressure of the presidency upon private men who had resisted settlement. Roosevelt wanted arbitration, and the miners were willing to accept it. The operators resisted, confident that recognizing the Union even indirectly would weaken their control. The meeting did not immediately solve the strike, but it altered the political weather around it. A dispute once framed by owners as private property had now been brought into the president's room. The negotiation did not move by command alone. Roosevelt needed intermediaries, political pressure, and a formula that could allow the operators to retreat without seeming to surrender. J.P. Morgan, whose financial influence touched the railroads and coal interests, became part of the settlement process. Elihu Root helped shape an arbitration commission that the owners could accept, partly by arranging its composition in a way that avoided direct formal recognition of the Union. The method was imperfect, but it worked. The miners returned to work, and the commission later granted wage increases and reduced hours, though it did not give full union recognition. The significance of the strike rested partly in what Roosevelt did not do. He did not send troops simply to break the strike for the operators. He did not treat the owners as the only respectable party. He did not pretend that the public had no stake because the mines were privately owned. Instead, he insisted that when private action threatened a national need, the president could step in as a representative of the public welfare. This was a broad claim, and it would become one of the foundations of the modern presidency. Northern Securities gave the same principle a legal form. The Northern Securities Company had been created as a holding company that brought together major railroad interests in the Northwest, associated with powerful financiers, including J.P. Morgan and James J. Hill. To many Americans, such consolidations seemed to reduce competition and place transportation under private arrangements too large for ordinary political control. The Sherman Antitrust Act had existed since 1890, but earlier enforcement had been uneven, and some business leaders did not expect the Roosevelt administration to use it aggressively against a great financial combination. Roosevelt's decision to bring suit against Northern Securities in 1902 startled the business world. Morgan reportedly believed such matters could be settled privately, perhaps by asking what the government wanted and adjusting accordingly. Roosevelt's answer was different. He wanted the matter brought under law. The distinction was essential because private negotiation with a financier would have confirmed the very problem reformers feared, that national economic questions could be arranged by a few powerful men outside public judgment. A court case made the issue visible, formal, and national. The case moved through the legal system until the Supreme Court in 1904 upheld the government's position and ordered the dissolution of Northern Securities. The decision did not destroy corporate capitalism, and Roosevelt never intended that it should. It did, however, show that federal antitrust law could reach the largest combinations when the executive branch chose to act. Business leaders had to consider that size and influence alone did not place them beyond prosecution. Reformers, meanwhile, saw that the presidency could use law against concentrated capital without abandoning the language of order. Roosevelt's trust policy was more selective than the nickname Trustbuster suggests. He did not believe every large corporation was bad, and he often distinguished between combinations that he thought served useful economic purposes and those he believed behaved irresponsibly. This distinction frustrated critics who wanted a more systematic attack on monopoly. It also reassured those who feared that reform would become indiscriminate. Roosevelt's position depended heavily on presidential judgment. He wanted enough discretion to decide which corporations were dangerous, and that desire gave the executive office a larger interpretive role in economic life. The Bureau of Corporations, established in 1903 within the Department of Commerce and Labor, fitted this method. Investigation could precede prosecution. Reports could expose practices without immediately breaking companies apart. Information itself became a tool of government because the modern corporation often hid its real structure behind legal devices, subsidiaries, rates, rebates, and private agreements. Roosevelt believed publicity could discipline power. A corporation forced into the light might become more governable even before a court reached it. Railroad regulation soon moved into the same field of concern. Railroads were the arteries of the industrial economy, carrying grain, coal, manufactured goods, livestock, passengers, and mail across enormous distances. Rate discrimination and secret rebates allowed favored shippers to gain advantages over smaller competitors. Farmers and merchants had complained about railroad power for decades, and the Interstate Commerce Commission, created in 1887, had often lacked the strength to impose effective control. Roosevelt saw that fairness in commerce required more than moral appeal. It required administrative authority with enough force to matter. The Elkins Act of 1903 and later the Hepburn Act of 1906 belonged to this effort, though the second came after Roosevelt had won election in his own right. These laws aimed to reduce rebates and strengthen federal power over rates. Their details were technical, but their political meaning was plain enough. The national government was moving deeper into the regulation of private economic systems that crossed state lines and touched daily life. Roosevelt did not invent all of this pressure, but he gave it presidential force and language. The courts remained both instrument and limit. Roosevelt respected law, but he did not worship legal delay when he believed public need was clear. This created tension with judges, conservatives, and business leaders who saw in his activism a threat to constitutional restraint. It also created tension with radicals who thought the courts protected property too strongly and that Roosevelt's reforms stopped well short of justice. The president stood between these criticisms with considerable confidence. He believed he was saving capitalism from its own abuses and saving democracy from the anger those abuses produced. That confidence helped him politically. By confronting trusts and intervening in the coal strike, Roosevelt presented himself as the defender of the general public against both corporate arrogance and class warfare. The position was powerful because many Americans did not want revolution, but they did want someone to restrain the men who seemed to command prices, wages, transportation, and public officials. Roosevelt gave them a president who spoke as if the nation itself had an interest distinct from every private faction. In the early 20th century, that was a potent claim. There was also an older moral inheritance at work. Roosevelt's father had taught him that privilege carried obligation. The adult Roosevelt translated that lesson into national politics, though he did so in a forceful and sometimes paternal manner. Wealth, in his view, was legitimate when attached to service, discipline, honesty, and public responsibility. It became dangerous when it imagined itself independent of the Commonwealth. This was why Bear's language during the coal strike offended him, and why Morgan's expectation of private settlement could not satisfy him. Both seemed to place private authority where public accountability belonged. The public response strengthened Roosevelt's hand. Newspapers covered the coal strike, the trust cases, and the president's interventions in ways that made him appear active on behalf of ordinary citizens. Families worried about winter fuel could understand the coal issue without reading legal briefs. Farmers and small merchants could understand resentment against railroad favoritism. Workers could see that the White House had not automatically treated their claims as illegitimate. Business leaders might dislike Roosevelt, but many citizens felt that he had made the presidency useful in a new way. Yet the new usefulness carried lasting questions. If the president could intervene because the public interest was at stake, then much depended on who defined that interest. Roosevelt trusted himself to do so. Later presidents would inherit the enlarged expectation without necessarily possessing his temperament, his popularity, or his caution about certain boundaries. In this sense, the coal strike and trust cases did more than solve immediate disputes. They widened the doorway through which future executive power would pass. By the middle of his presidency, Roosevelt had shown that the White House could become a forum, a lever, and a judge in the industrial age. The coal operators had been pressed into arbitration. Northern securities had been brought under law. Railroad regulation had gathered momentum. The Bureau of Corporations had made investigation part of federal economic policy. None of this ended inequality, monopoly, labor conflict, or corporate influence. It did something more limited and still very important. It made national power visible where private power had grown accustomed to acting with less restraint. The same habit of public stewardship would soon turn with equal force toward land. If corporations could not be allowed to consume the public interest in the marketplace, forests, rivers, wildlife, and canyons could not be left entirely to private appetite either. Roosevelt's presidency was beginning to treat the nation not only as an economy to be regulated, but as a physical inheritance to be guarded, measured, used, and preserved. Chapter 10: Conservation and the Vast Public Domain. The American landscape had been part of Theodore Roosevelt's imagination long before he had the power to protect any part of it. As a boy, he had collected specimens in rooms filled with books and family order. As a young man in Dakota, he had watched the open range offer hardship, beauty, loss, and instruction without asking permission from human ambition. Hunting had taught him intimacy with animals, though in a form modern readers may find uneasy. Ranching had taught him that land could be exhausted when too much confidence rested upon it. By the time he reached the presidency, the physical nation was not scenery to him. It was inheritance, resource, discipline, and responsibility. America in the early 20th century still possessed enormous public lands, but the old assumption that abundance would last without management had begun to break down. Forests had been cut with speed in many regions. Wildlife populations had fallen under commercial hunting and market demand. Rivers and watersheds were tied to agriculture and settlement, and Western development pressed constantly against federal ownership. The frontier, in the older sense, was closing. That closing mattered to Roosevelt because he believed the frontier had helped make American character. If the country consumed the land carelessly, it would lose not only timber or game, but a school of national strength. Gifford Pinchot became Roosevelt's most important conservation ally inside government. Trained in forestry and deeply committed to professional management, Pinchot believed forests should be used wisely rather than locked away entirely. His conservation was practical, administrative, and scientific. Trees were not only beautiful living things, they were timber, water protection, soil stability, future supply, and public wealth. Roosevelt trusted him because Pinchot translated feeling for land into policy, offices, maps, reports, and rules. The friendship between the two men joined Roosevelt's public force to Pinchot's technical discipline. That distinction mattered because conservation was never one idea only. John Muir, the naturalist and preservationist, spoke for a more reverent attitude toward wild places, especially the mountains and valleys of the Sierra Nevada. Pinchot spoke for managed use, for sustained yield, for the trained forester guarding public resources from waste. Roosevelt stood between these currents, not always evenly. He loved wild country and admired Muir, but he also believed in use, development, irrigation, timber, grazing, and national planning. His conservation presidency would therefore protect land while also organizing it for future human purposes. In 1903, Roosevelt traveled with Muir in Yosemite, and that journey became one of the remembered miniatures of American conservation. The president and the naturalist spent time among the great trees and granite forms of the Sierra, away from the ordinary machinery of Washington. Muir wanted Roosevelt to see Yosemite not merely as useful land, not merely as a place for tourists, timber calculations, or state management, but as something whose grandeur required federal protection. Roosevelt listened. The trip did not turn him into Muir's disciple, but it strengthened his willingness to treat exceptional landscapes as national possessions, in the moral sense as well as the legal one. Yosemite had already been protected in earlier forms, and Yellowstone had been a national park since 1872. But Roosevelt's importance lay in the scale and energy of his actions. He did not invent American conservation. He accelerated it and placed it closer to the center of presidential duty. Under his administration, the federal government greatly expanded national forests, created wildlife refuges, protected monuments, and treated the public domain as something more than a reserve waiting for private acquisition. The old habit had been disposal. Roosevelt and Pinchot made retention and management more respectable. The numbers were large enough to matter. During Roosevelt's presidency, national forest reserves grew by tens of millions of acres, and federal protection reached forests, bird reservations, game preserves, and national monuments. Acreage can become dull when recited without context, but in this case the scale carries the meaning. Land that might have passed into private hands, been cut without long planning, or been treated as an inexhaustible store was kept under public authority. A line on a federal map could decide the future of a watershed, a valley, a stand of timber, or a nesting ground. The Antiquities Act of 1906 gave Roosevelt a particularly useful instrument. The law allowed presidents to declare national monuments on federal land in order to protect historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and objects of historic or scientific interest. The language gave the executive branch room to move with unusual speed. Roosevelt used that room boldly. He declared Devil's Tower the first national monument in 1906, and later used the act to protect places whose scale stretched the meaning of the statute, most famously the Grand Canyon. The act turned presidential judgment into a shield for land that Congress might have protected too slowly or not at all. The Grand Canyon showed the reach of that judgment. To many Americans, it was already an extraordinary landscape, but mining claims, development pressures, and competing ideas of use surrounded it. Roosevelt visited the canyon in 1903 and urged that it be left as it was, language that has often been remembered because it sounded so plain. In 1908, he declared the Grand Canyon a national monument. The decision did not settle every future battle over the canyon, and national park status would come later, but the monument designation placed federal protection across a landscape too vast and strange to be treated as ordinary real estate. Bird protection formed another part of the conservation record. Market hunting had damaged many bird populations, especially when feathers became fashionable in women's hats and when birds were killed in large numbers for commercial purposes. Pelican Island in Florida became the first federal bird reservation in 1903, set aside after concern for nesting birds there. The detail is small beside the Grand Canyon, but it shows the range of Roosevelt's conservation imagination. Protection could mean canyons, forests, and mountains. It could also mean a low island where birds nested beyond the reach of plume hunters. William Temple Hornaday, the zoologist and conservationist, helped represent the wildlife side of the movement. Hornaday had seen the destruction of the American bison and worked to preserve animals through zoological institutions and public advocacy. Roosevelt shared with him a hunter's knowledge that game could disappear. This was one of the central tensions in Roosevelt's thought. He was a hunter who loved pursuit, trophies, rifles, and the literature of the chase. Yet he also understood that unregulated killing could empty the very world that hunters claimed to love. The hunter became a conservationist, partly because he knew the animal as a finite presence. The Boone and Crockett Club, which Roosevelt had helped found in 1887, belonged to this older conservation network. Its members were elite sportsmen, naturalists, and public men who promoted fair chase, game laws, and habitat protection. Their outlook was not democratic in every respect, and it often carried assumptions of class, masculinity, and control. Yet it mattered because it turned sport hunting away from mere extraction and toward regulation. Roosevelt's conservation politics grew partly from this world of clubs, rifles, specimens, and law, where saving animals and hunting them could appear not as opposites, but as linked obligations. Reclamation also belonged to his land policy. The Newlands Reclamation Act of 1902 supported federal irrigation projects in the arid West, using proceeds from public land sales to fund dams, canals, and water systems. For settlers and farmers, water could make the difference between hope and failure. For the federal government, reclamation meant a deeper role in shaping Western development. Roosevelt supported it because he believed the West should be settled by families and communities rather than controlled only by large private interests. Water policy, in this sense, became another form of national planning. Such planning created conflicts. Ranchers worried about grazing rules. Timber companies disliked federal restriction. Western politicians often accused Washington of controlling land that local communities believed should be available for development. Preservationists thought Pinchot's utilitarian approach could be too willing to cut, manage, and calculate. Business interests saw valuable resources being withdrawn from easier access. Conservation was not a gentle consensus. It was a political struggle over who had the right to decide the future of land, water, timber, minerals, animals, and local economies. Roosevelt's answer was characteristically national. He believed the federal government had to act because local pressure could be too narrow and private appetite too short-sighted. A forest cut for immediate profit might leave downstream farmers with erosion and flood. A river claimed without planning might limit future settlement. A species killed for market could vanish from the country's living inheritance. The public domain, therefore, had to be held in trust not only for those who lived near it, but for the nation and for generations not yet able to speak for themselves. The 1908 Conference of Governors brought this thinking into formal public view. Roosevelt gathered governors, cabinet members, Supreme Court justices, and experts to discuss natural resources at the White House. The meeting treated conservation as a national issue, requiring coordinated policy, not merely as a collection of local disputes. Rivers, forests, minerals, soils, and water power were placed in the same broad frame of public responsibility. The conference helped make conservation a language of statecraft. It also showed how Roosevelt liked to govern: assemble prominent men, dramatize the issue, claim the public interest, and turn concern into administrative momentum. Scientific expertise mattered throughout this work. Men such as Pinchot and Charles D. Walcott represented a growing belief that government should know more, measure more, and manage more carefully. Surveys, maps, classifications, forest studies, geological knowledge, and biological research gave conservation a factual base. Roosevelt admired action, but he did not think action should be blind. He wanted experts who could tell him what the land contained, how fast it was being used, and what laws or reserves might preserve its value. The presidency became a place where expertise and will met. There was also a moral imagination beneath the administrative effort. Roosevelt feared waste because waste suggested a failure of character. A nation that stripped forests, destroyed wildlife, and treated public land as loot was, in his eyes, behaving like a weak or selfish man. Conservation became part of the strenuous life, not an escape from it. It demanded restraint, foresight, discipline, and the willingness to deny immediate desire for a larger future. The same ethic that made him admire bodily training and military preparedness made him admire a forest policy that refused careless consumption. Modern readers may see the contradictions more sharply. Roosevelt protected wildlife and killed many animals. He defended public land while supporting imperial policies abroad. He admired nature while often speaking of it through conquest, vigor, and masculine testing. These contradictions are real, and they belong to the man rather than to a later misunderstanding of him. Yet his conservation record remains one of the most consequential parts of his presidency because it placed federal authority behind the idea that land could be more than property waiting to be used up. The public response was mixed but lasting. Many citizens admired the protection of spectacular places. Others felt federal rules most directly when they limited grazing, timber, mining, or water claims. Eastern reformers could praise public stewardship without always bearing the local costs. Western communities could resent Washington while still depending on federal irrigation, surveying, and infrastructure. Conservation, like the Square Deal, did not remove conflict. It organized conflict around a new assumption. The nation had a legitimate interest in the future condition of its own physical body. By the time Roosevelt left office, conservation had become one of the clearest expressions of his presidency. The same executive energy that pressed coal operators and challenged railroad combinations had moved across forests, canyons, islands, and rivers. It had created offices, reserves, monuments, and expectations that outlived the arguments of the moment. The land itself became part of the story of presidential power, not as a silent backdrop, but as a field of decision. Roosevelt's America was no longer only a continental republic filling space from east to west. It was becoming a nation that regulated corporations, mediated labor conflict, protected landscapes, built administrative knowledge, and looked outward across oceans. The canal he wanted through Panama, the fleet he would send around the world, and the diplomatic role he would claim between empires all belonged to that same expanding vision. Public power, once awakened at home, did not stop at the shoreline. Chapter 11: Panama, Sea Power, and the World Stage. Panama entered Theodore Roosevelt's presidency as geography, ambition, and impatience joined into one problem. For centuries, maps had made the narrow land between the Atlantic and Pacific seem almost like an invitation. Ships crossing from one ocean to the other had to travel around South America through long routes that consumed time, coal, money, and naval strength. A canal through the isthmus promised a different kind of world, one in which commerce and warships could move with an efficiency that older empires had imagined but never completed. Roosevelt looked at that narrow strip of land and saw not only an engineering project, but a test of whether the United States intended to act like a great power. The desire for an Isthmian canal did not begin with him. American officials had studied routes through Nicaragua and Panama for decades, while French engineers had already tried and failed to cut a canal through Panama under Ferdinand de Lesseps, the builder associated with the Suez Canal. The French effort had left behind machinery, excavations, rights, debts, disease, scandal, and a company still trying to salvage value from what remained. By the time Roosevelt became president, the question was not whether the canal was useful. The question was where it would be built, under what authority, and how quickly American power could make the decision real. Engineering and medicine stood beside diplomacy from the beginning. Panama's tropical environment had defeated earlier confidence with yellow fever, malaria, landslides, rain, heat, and administrative disorder. The French had lost thousands of workers, and their failure warned every serious observer that courage and money would not be enough. A successful canal required excavation on an immense scale, but it also required sanitation, hospitals, mosquito control, housing, food supply, rail movement, and steady command. Roosevelt admired dramatic action, yet the canal would finally depend upon disciplined systems as much as presidential force. Colombia controlled Panama at the time, and the United States negotiated with Colombian authorities for canal rights. The Hay-Haran Treaty of 1903 would have granted the United States a renewable lease over a canal zone, but the Colombian Senate rejected it. Colombian objections included sovereignty, money, and resentment at terms many regarded as inadequate. To Roosevelt, the rejection looked like obstruction at the moment when history had opened a path. To Colombians, the matter looked very different. A powerful nation wanted extraordinary control over a strategic strip of their territory, and delay could be a way to demand better terms. Roosevelt's patience with Colombian sovereignty was limited. Philippe Bunau-Varilla, a French engineer and promoter tied to the old canal company, had a powerful interest in seeing the Panama route chosen and the French company's rights purchased. Panamanian separatists also had reasons to seek independence from Colombia, especially if American backing could secure the new state's future. In November 1903, Panama declared independence. American naval presence helped prevent Colombia from suppressing the revolt, and the United States recognized the new republic with remarkable speed. Soon afterward, a canal treaty was signed between the United States and the newly independent Panama. The miniature of the canal decision lies partly in paper rather than ceremony. The Hay-Buno-Varilla Treaty, signed in November 1903, gave the United States control over the canal zone under terms highly favorable to Washington. Buno-Varilla signed for Panama, though he was not Panamanian and had his own connection to the French canal interests. The arrangement exposed the bluntness of power inside diplomatic form. A new republic had appeared, a treaty had been written, and the United States had obtained the legal framework it wanted. The ink on the document carried more force than many armies because it fixed control for generations. Roosevelt later defended his conduct with characteristic directness. He believed he had acted decisively where lesser men would have allowed delay to smother a great work. His famous statement that he took the canal zone and let Congress debate afterward captured both his pride and his critics' concern. To supporters, he had cut through corruption, weakness, and diplomatic obstruction in order to build something of global value. To critics, he had used American power to separate territory from a weaker country and then dress the result in legal language. Both readings have remained close to the canal's history. Work on the canal demanded a different kind of heroism from the one Roosevelt usually made famous. John Finley Wallace served first as chief engineer under the American effort, but the early period was difficult and uncertain. John Stevens later reorganized the project, emphasizing railroads, supplies, housing, and the practical sequence by which Earth could actually be moved. Colonel George Washington Goethals eventually brought the canal to completion under a more military style of administration. The Great Cut through the Continental Divide, the locks, the dams, and the controlled lake system required patience measured in years and cubic yards, not campaign speeches. Medical reform made the work possible. Dr. William C. Gorgas, drawing upon the understanding that mosquitoes carried yellow fever and malaria, organized sanitation campaigns that changed the conditions under which laborers lived and worked. Standing water had to be drained or treated. Screens, fumigation, quarantine measures, and public health rules became as important as steam shovels. Disease had ruined the French project in part because the cause of yellow fever had not been properly understood. The American project benefited from newer knowledge, and the canal became one of the great examples of public health serving imperial engineering. The labor force came from many places, especially the Caribbean. Workers from Barbados, Jamaica, Martinique, Spain, Italy, and elsewhere did the exhausting labor that turned presidential ambition into a physical channel. The work was racially stratified, with gold roll and silver roll systems separating pay, housing, status, and treatment, largely along racial and national lines. American administrators and engineers received privileges that West Indian laborers did not. The canal therefore belonged to national glory in one telling, and to hard, unequal labor in another. Its banks carried both achievement and hierarchy. Roosevelt visited Panama in 1906, becoming the first sitting American president to travel outside the United States while in office. Photographs showed him in white clothing, inspecting machinery, sitting on a steam shovel, and making the canal a visible extension of presidential energy. The images mattered. They brought an enormous engineering project into the American imagination through the body of the president himself. He was not only authorizing the canal from Washington, he appeared at the site, near the machines, mud, workers, and officials who were making it real. Sea power gave the canal wider meaning. Roosevelt had long believed, with Alfred Thayer Mahan, that a modern power required a strong navy and the ability to move it between oceans. Without a canal, the Atlantic and Pacific fleets were separated by geography. With a canal, the United States could imagine itself as a two-ocean power in a more practical sense. The canal was therefore not simply about trade. It was about war planning, imperial possession, Pacific reach, Caribbean control, and the speed with which American force could appear where it was needed. The same vision shaped the Great White Fleet. In 1907, Roosevelt sent 16 battleships on a voyage around the world, their white painted hulls and disciplined movement offering a floating advertisement of American naval power. The fleet traveled to Latin America, the Pacific, Australia, Japan, China, the Philippines, the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean, and back to the United States. The voyage required coal, ports, logistics, ceremony, and diplomacy. It was not a war. It was a message written in steel and distance. Japan stood near the center of Roosevelt's concern. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904–1905 had ended with Japan's rise as a major military power and Russia's humiliation. Roosevelt mediated between the two at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, helping bring about the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905. For that role, he received the Nobel Peace Prize, the first American to do so. Yet the peace he helped arrange did not come from sentimental pacifism. It came from balance of power thinking. Roosevelt respected Japan's strength, feared instability in Asia, and wanted an outcome that prevented either Russian collapse or Japanese overreach from disturbing American interests. Relations with Japan also carried tension at home. Anti-Japanese sentiment on the American West Coast, especially in California, created diplomatic difficulty. San Francisco's attempt to segregate Japanese schoolchildren in 1906 angered Japan and embarrassed the Roosevelt administration. The gentleman's agreement that followed limited Japanese labor migration while easing the school issue. The arrangement avoided a formal exclusion law for the moment, but it reflected the racial politics of the period. Roosevelt wanted to preserve American honor abroad and domestic calm at home, and the compromise showed how often those aims were shaped by prejudice as well as diplomacy. Latin America became another field of Roosevelt's assertive policy. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, announced in 1904, stated that chronic wrongdoing or instability in Latin American countries could require intervention by the United States. The language presented American action as a form of international police power in the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt believed this would prevent European intervention and keep order near American shores. Latin American critics and later historians would see the doctrine as a claim of regional dominance. It gave moral vocabulary to unequal power. The Dominican Republic became an early example. Financial instability there raised the possibility of European creditors intervening to collect debts. Roosevelt's administration moved toward American supervision of customs revenues, arranging a system through which debts could be paid while European powers were kept away. To Roosevelt, this was prudent management under the Monroe Doctrine. To those wary of American expansion, it showed how easily financial disorder could become a doorway for foreign control. The United States did not need to annex a country in order to shape its choices. Cuba remained tied to American power as well. The Platt Amendment, adopted before Roosevelt's presidency but active during it, limited Cuban sovereignty by giving the United States the right to intervene, and by securing a naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Roosevelt's administration later intervened in Cuba during political disorder in 1906, establishing a provisional occupation. The language of protection and stability appeared again. So did the reality that smaller nations in the Caribbean lived under the shadow of American decision. Roosevelt's foreign policy often joined order to hierarchy, and the hierarchy was rarely hidden from those beneath it. Europe watched him with a mixture of curiosity, respect, and unease. Roosevelt understood that diplomacy required manners, but he did not believe manners should replace force. He wanted the United States to be taken seriously by older powers, and seriousness in his mind required the ability to act. Arbitration, mediation, naval display, canal construction, and hemispheric pressure all belong to the same pattern. Peace was desirable, but peace without strength looked temporary to him. Good intentions without ships seemed almost irresponsible. There was intelligence in this view and danger. Roosevelt saw earlier than many Americans that the United States could not become industrially powerful, hold overseas possessions, build a canal, and still behave as though it were detached from world politics. He also assumed that American judgment had a right to organize weaker regions when disorder appeared to threaten broader interests. The result was a foreign policy that could produce negotiation and coercion in the same breath. It could win a peace prize and defend intervention. It could speak of civilization while making unequal arrangements that lasted long after the speeches faded. The Panama Canal itself would not open until 1914, after Roosevelt had left office, but its decisive political birth belonged to his presidency. He had chosen the route, accepted the revolution's usefulness, secured the treaty, and made the project a test of national competence. The work continued through heat, disease control, excavation, racial hierarchy, engineering discipline, and administrative pressure. When ships finally passed through, they moved inside a channel made by many hands, but authorized by a president who believed delay was often the enemy of greatness. By the end of Roosevelt's presidency, the United States had become more visible in the world than it had been when he entered office. It had asserted power in the Caribbean, claimed a stronger voice in Latin America, mediated between empires, displayed its fleet across oceans, and committed itself to a canal that changed global movement. These actions did not form a peaceful retreat from domestic reform. They were the outward face of the same presidency that had challenged trusts and protected forests. Roosevelt believed public power should act at home and abroad when the stakes were large enough. Yet the stage that gave him such satisfaction could not hold him forever. He had promised not to seek another elected term after winning in 1904, a promise that would come to feel more confining once the end of his presidency approached. The canal, the fleet, the forests, the trusts, and the square deal had filled the office with motion. But Roosevelt was still a man who struggled to accept finished chapters in his own life. When he left the White House, the question was not whether he had enough fame. It was whether he could live without the daily possession of power. Chapter 12. The Man Who Would Not Stay Finished. Theodore Roosevelt left the presidency in March 1909 with a public reputation larger than the office he was surrendering. He had promised, after winning the election of 1904, that he would not seek another term, and the promise had pleased those who feared his appetite for power. At the time, it may even have pleased Roosevelt himself because it allowed him to present restraint as part of his character. Yet promises made in moments of triumph can become difficult companions once the triumph has passed. The White House had suited him too well, and no private life, however comfortable, could easily replace the daily possession of national authority. William Howard Taft inherited the presidency with Roosevelt's blessing. The choice made sense in many ways. Taft had served as Governor General of the Philippines, Secretary of War, and trusted member of Roosevelt's administration. He was intelligent, experienced, personally warm, and loyal to the broad Republican order that Roosevelt wanted to preserve. Roosevelt believed Taft would continue the central work of reform without disturbing the party beyond repair. He also believed, perhaps too confidently, that his own judgment of men could shape the future after he had left the room. Taft was not Roosevelt in another body. He was more judicial in temperament, less theatrical in politics, more respectful of legal process, and less inclined to treat the presidency as a pulpit from which the nation could be stirred into motion. Where Roosevelt loved pressure, Taft often preferred procedure. Where Roosevelt turned public attention into leverage, Taft could seem almost burdened by the need to perform leadership for a mass audience. This difference did not make Taft weak, though Roosevelt would increasingly see him that way. It made him unsuited to live comfortably inside another man's shadow. Roosevelt did not remain in the country to watch the early Taft administration unfold. Soon after leaving office, he departed for Africa on a hunting and scientific expedition connected to the Smithsonian Institution. The journey gave him what he wanted most after surrendering power: movement, risk, writing, animals, distance, and a public reason to remain active without immediately appearing to interfere in politics. Kermit Roosevelt accompanied him, and the expedition became both father-son undertaking and national spectacle. Even away from office, Roosevelt traveled under the gaze of newspapers that knew readers still wanted him. The African expedition was not a casual sporting holiday. It involved planning, guides, porters, rifles, camps, taxidermy, transport, and the collection of specimens for American museums. Thousands of animal specimens, large and small, were gathered for scientific institutions, and the scale can unsettle modern readers who approach conservation through later assumptions. To Roosevelt, hunting and conservation did not cancel each other. Specimens belonged to science. Regulated hunting belonged to character, and the protection of species required knowledge as well as sentiment. His world could place a rifle and a museum label inside the same moral order. The journey also allowed Roosevelt to return to a version of himself that predated the presidency. He was again the naturalist, hunter, writer, and strenuous traveler, measuring body and will against landscape. Yet Africa was not Dakota. It was an imperial world of British colonial administration, African labor, local expertise, racial hierarchy, and European assumptions about land and rule. Roosevelt admired much of British imperial order, and he moved through that world with the confidence of a man from another rising power. He saw discipline and governance where later eyes see domination more clearly. Reports from the expedition kept him present in American life. He wrote, collected, observed, and turned experience into prose with the old habit of possession through language. Even absence became another form of publicity. Roosevelt had left Washington, but he had not become unavailable to national imagination. This mattered because Taft's presidency was beginning to meet the ordinary difficulties that follow a powerful predecessor. Every decision could be compared to Roosevelt's memory. Every hesitation could be read as decline by men who missed the older urgency. After Africa, Roosevelt traveled through Europe, where he was received with honors usually given to heads of state. He met monarchs, statesmen, soldiers, scholars, and public men who regarded him as the most vivid American of his age. In 1910, he delivered his famous address at the Sorbonne in Paris, speaking on citizenship, character, duty, and the moral obligations of civilized life. The speech showed how fully Roosevelt had become an international public figure. He was no longer only a former president of the United States. He was a symbol of American vigor, admired and questioned by older nations watching the republic's rise. When Roosevelt returned to the United States in June 1910, the political country waiting for him had changed during his absence. Progressive Republicans were increasingly dissatisfied with Taft. Conservatives remained powerful in Congress. The tariff issue had damaged Taft's standing with reformers after the Payne-Aldrich tariff seemed to many progressives a retreat from meaningful revision. The Ballinger-Pinchot controversy had struck even closer to Roosevelt's own legacy because it involved conservation, public lands, and the dismissal of Gifford Pinchot, Roosevelt's trusted ally. What might have been policy disagreement began to feel personal. Pinchot's removal mattered because he represented more than one official. He embodied the conservation administration Roosevelt had helped build. Richard Ballinger, Taft's Secretary of the Interior, was accused by Pinchot and others of being too sympathetic to private claims on public resources. Taft defended Ballinger and dismissed Pinchot after public conflict. To Roosevelt's circle, this looked like betrayal of conservation. To Taft, it looked like the necessary defense of administrative order and presidential authority. The dispute turned land policy into a test of loyalty to Roosevelt's inheritance. Roosevelt at first moved carefully. He did not immediately declare war on Taft, and he knew the danger of appearing vain, impatient, or hungry for a return to power. Yet he also began to speak in ways that showed how far his thinking had moved beyond the more cautious republicanism of many party leaders. At Osawatomie, Kansas, in August 1910, he gave the speech known as the New Nationalism. There he argued for a stronger federal role in regulating corporations, protecting workers, and securing social justice under conditions of modern industrial life. The language went beyond the older square deal, or at least made its implications more explicit. The new nationalism placed national power at the center of democratic reform. Roosevelt homogeneity argued that political democracy had to control economic power, and that property rights had to stand below human welfare when the two came into conflict. This did not make him a socialist. He still believed in private property, enterprise, competition, and hierarchy, but he had come to believe that great corporations were permanent features of modern life and had to be supervised by an equally strong public authority. In his mind, concentration of economic power required concentration of democratic control. Taft's approach differed sharply. His administration actually brought many antitrust cases, more in number than Roosevelt's, but Taft's legal method did not satisfy progressives who wanted a broader public philosophy of reform. The prosecution of U.S. Steel angered Roosevelt because it touched a merger he believed he had allowed during the Panic of 1907 for reasons of financial stability. Taft saw legal duty. Roosevelt saw an attack on his judgment. Their disagreement was therefore not only about trusts, it was about who had the right to define wise public action in a modern economy. Letters, intermediaries, and private conversations could not repair the widening breach. The old warmth between the two men weakened under the pressure of friends, newspapers, policy disputes, and wounded pride. Taft felt judged by the man who had helped place him in office. Roosevelt felt that Taft had mishandled the reform inheritance entrusted to him. Each had reason to feel injured. Taft had been expected to govern as himself, while being measured against Roosevelt. Roosevelt had expected continuity and instead saw caution, legalism, and conservative influence where he had imagined forward movement. The Republican Party contained this quarrel only with increasing difficulty. Progressive insurgents challenged conservative leadership in Congress and in the states. Figures such as Robert La Follette had their own reform credentials and did not exist merely as Roosevelt's followers. Western progressives wanted more democracy, more regulation, and more resistance to corporate influence. Eastern conservatives feared that such politics would divide the party and threaten business confidence. Roosevelt moved among these currents as both leader and rival because his return gave progressives a famous champion while also complicating their existing movements. Sagamore Hill became a political weather station. Visitors came to Oyster Bay to consult the former president, seek endorsement, measure his intentions, and carry messages back into the Republican world. Edith Roosevelt guarded the household's privacy as best she could, but Theodore's public life continually pressed against domestic boundaries. Letters arrived, journalists watched, allies surged, critics warned, and old friends chose sides. The house that had once represented continuity after grief now became a place where national politics waited on Roosevelt's mood. His restlessness was not merely ambition, though ambition never left him. Roosevelt believed that public life imposed obligations on men capable of action. He also believed, with great convenience to himself, that he remained uniquely capable of meeting the country's needs. This was one of the most revealing features of his character. He distrusted selfishness, but he could interpret his own desire for power as duty with remarkable ease. The line between service and self-assertion did not disappear. It blurred because both were genuinely present. By 1911 and 1912, the possibility of Roosevelt challenging Taft for the Republican nomination became increasingly real. At first, many progressives looked to La Follette, but Roosevelt's fame changed the calculation once he allowed himself to be considered. He had said he would not seek another term after 1904, but he now argued that the promise applied to consecutive terms, not to a later call from the people. The distinction satisfied his supporters more than his critics. To those who loved him, it sounded like availability. To those who feared him, it sounded like appetite dressed in legal phrasing. The break with Taft became one of the great personal and political ruptures of the progressive era. It was painful because it emerged from friendship, shared administration, and intended continuity. It was consequential because it divided the Republican Party at a moment when the country was debating the shape of modern democracy. Roosevelt had left the White House hoping to remain the author of an era without holding office. He returned to find that influence without control did not satisfy him, and that the man he had chosen as successor would not remain a steward of Roosevelt's will. A finished public life might have rested on the presidency, the canal, conservation, the Nobel Peace Prize, and a reputation no American politician of his generation could ignore. Roosevelt could have written, hunted, advised, traveled, and aged as a revered former president. He could not do it. The habits formed in childhood, hardened in Dakota, magnified by war, and enlarged by the presidency would not settle into ceremonial retirement. The fight he had once carried into institutions now turned back upon his own party, his chosen successor, and the question of whether the people still wanted him at the center of the national story. Chapter 13: The Bull Moose and the Broken Party. The Republican Party entered 1912 carrying a division it could no longer hide. Theodore Roosevelt had once treated the party as the necessary vessel of reform, the structure through which principle could acquire power rather than remain a speech. William Howard Taft had inherited that same party as president, but he had inherited it with conservatives, progressives, legalists, insurgents, old bosses, new reformers, and the heavy memory of Roosevelt himself, all pressing upon him. What had begun as disappointment between two men widened into a conflict over the future of Republican government. By the time the nomination fight opened, the question was no longer merely whether Taft had been faithful to Roosevelt. It was whether the party could contain both of them. Roosevelt did not enter the contest as a minor rebel. He entered as a former president with a national following, a heroic war image, a reform record, and a gift for turning political argument into moral drama. His supporters believed he alone could rescue the progressive cause from Taft's caution and from the conservative men who still held power inside the party machinery. Taft's supporters believed the president had governed responsibly, enforced the law, and deserved renomination according to party custom. Each side could claim legitimacy. Taft held the office and much of the organization. Roosevelt claimed the energy of the people who wanted the party moved forward. The primaries gave Roosevelt evidence for that claim. In several states where Republican voters could express their choice directly, he performed strongly and defeated Taft. Progressive reformers took this as proof that the ordinary party rank and file preferred Roosevelt when allowed to speak. Taft's strength lay more heavily in delegates chosen by older conventions and party systems, especially in the South, where Republican organizations were often small, patronage dependent, and vulnerable to accusations of being controlled from above. The contest therefore became not only a personal rivalry, but a dispute over how democracy inside a party should be measured. Robert La Follette stood awkwardly within this moment. He had been one of the most serious progressive Republicans before Roosevelt's return, with deep roots in Wisconsin reform and a long record of challenging railroad and corporate influence. Many progressives had looked to him before Roosevelt allowed himself to be drafted into the fight. Roosevelt's entry overshadowed him, and La Follette never forgave the ease with which the former president drew attention away from men who had stayed in the reform struggle while he was abroad, hunting, writing, and watching. The progressive cause did not belong to Roosevelt alone, but Roosevelt's presence could make it seem that way. The Republican National Convention met in Chicago in June 1912, and there the dispute over delegates became the central battlefield. Roosevelt's campaign charged that Taft forces had seated contested delegates unfairly, especially from states where Roosevelt men believed they had the stronger claim. Taft's managers insisted they were following party rules. The convention machinery favored the sitting president, and Roosevelt's supporters grew increasingly convinced that the nomination was being taken through procedure after it had been lost in spirit. This was the sort of accusation Roosevelt knew how to make powerful. To him, technical victory without moral legitimacy was not victory at all. Chicago became a lesson in the difference between popular energy and institutional control. Roosevelt could command crowds, newspapers, and reform sentiment, but the convention controlled credentials, roll calls, committees, and recognition from the chair. His supporters tried to challenge the process, but the machinery held. Taft was renominated. The result was legal within the party's formal procedures, but Roosevelt and his followers regarded it as a theft. Once that judgment settled, compromise became almost impossible. A man who had spent his life telling himself that public struggle revealed character could not easily accept that the rules had defeated the cause. The break came quickly. Roosevelt's supporters formed the Progressive Party, soon known by the phrase that attached itself to Roosevelt after he declared himself fit as a bull moose. The name had a humor and force that suited him perfectly. It made the new party feel less like a committee and more like a living creature, broad-shouldered, stubborn, and ready to move through the brush. Yet beneath the phrase was a serious political project. The Progressive Party tried to gather scattered reforms into a national platform and to make the federal government the instrument of a more democratic industrial order. The Progressive Platform of 1912 was unusually ambitious. It supported women's suffrage, social insurance, limits on campaign spending, labor protections, regulation of corporations, easier constitutional amendment, direct election of senators, initiative, referendum, recall in some forms, and a stronger federal role in public welfare. Jane Addams, the settlement house reformer from Hull House, seconded Roosevelt's nomination, giving the new party a moral and social reform authority beyond Roosevelt's own martial and executive image. Hiram Johnson of California became his running mate, linking the ticket to Western progressivism and anti-railroad reform. The party was not only Roosevelt's vehicle, though his personality gave it its central force. For Roosevelt, the campaign became a way to argue that democracy had to master the modern economy or become hollow. He no longer spoke merely of bad trusts to be broken apart. He increasingly accepted that large corporations were permanent features of industrial life and should be regulated by strong public authority. The new nationalism formed the backbone of his argument. It treated the national government as the only power large enough to confront national corporations, national markets, and national social problems. Where older Republican language had often feared centralized power, Roosevelt now feared private power that government was too weak to supervise. Woodrow Wilson offered a rival progressive vision. As the Democratic governor of New Jersey, and then the Democratic nominee for president, Wilson argued for what he called the new freedom, with more emphasis on restoring competition and breaking up concentrated privilege. His language could sound cleaner, more legal, and more suspicious of bigness than Roosevelt's. Roosevelt accepted bigness under regulation. Wilson often spoke as though democracy required bigness to be reduced. The difference was not absolute, and both men would change in office. But the campaign gave voters two reform languages, one centered on regulated national power and the other on renewed competition under law. Taft, meanwhile, occupied a painful position. He was President of the United States, the official Republican nominee, and a man increasingly abandoned by the emotional center of his own party. He did not have Roosevelt's gift for public combat, and the campaign wounded him personally. Taft believed Roosevelt had broken faith, exaggerated disagreements, and placed personal ambition above party order. Roosevelt believed Taft had allowed reactionaries to capture the party and betray reform. The old friendship had become almost irrecoverable because each man could tell himself a story in which the other had failed in character. The public spectacle of the campaign was intense, but not every voter saw Roosevelt as the obvious answer. Some feared that a third Roosevelt term, even after an intervening presidency, would place too much power in one man's hands. Others thought the progressive program went too far towards centralized authority. Conservatives regarded him as dangerous. Socialists thought his reforms left capitalism intact and therefore left exploitation in place. Many ordinary Republicans simply did not want their party torn apart, even if they admired parts of Roosevelt's record. The Bull Moose movement had energy, but it also carried the cost of rupture. On October 14, 1912, in Milwaukee, the campaign acquired one of its most famous scenes. John Schrank, a disturbed man who had been following Roosevelt, shot him before a scheduled speech. The bullet passed through Roosevelt's steel eyeglass case and the folded manuscript in his breast pocket before lodging in his chest. Roosevelt, after determining that he was not coughing blood and therefore judging the wound not immediately fatal, insisted on speaking. The manuscript itself, thick with pages, had helped slow the bullet. A political text had become, in the most literal way, a material object between Roosevelt and death. The speech that followed has often been told as pure legend, but its power rests partly in the plain facts. Roosevelt stood before the audience with the wound in his body and spoke for a shortened but still remarkable time before going to the hospital. He told the crowd he had been shot and that it took more than that to kill a bull moose. The sentence became inseparable from his image, though the deeper meaning of the event lay in how perfectly it matched the life he had built. The sickly child, the boxer, the ranchman, the soldier, the president, and the insurgent candidate all seemed to meet in that one public act of endurance. Yet endurance did not mean victory. The election of 1912 split the Republican vote between Taft and Roosevelt, allowing Wilson to win the presidency with a minority of the popular vote, but a commanding electoral majority. Roosevelt finished second ahead of Taft, making the Progressive Party the most successful third-party presidential effort in American history up to that point. Taft's showing was humiliating. The Republican Party was broken for the election, and Wilson entered the White House because reform had divided against itself, as much as because Democrats had united. The numbers carried a hard lesson. Roosevelt had proved that millions of Americans still wanted him, and that a progressive Republican insurgency could become a national movement. He had also proved that personal following could not easily replace party structure. The Progressive Party won enthusiasm, speeches, platforms, and moral drama, but it lacked the deep machinery that older parties possessed. It could gather around Roosevelt in 1912. Whether it could live without him, or even beside him once defeat had arrived, was another matter. After the election, Roosevelt remained proud of the cause, but had to face the limits of the movement he had led. The Progressive Party had drawn reformers, intellectuals, social workers, Western insurgents, former Republicans, and citizens dissatisfied with ordinary party choices. But its unity rested on a difficult balance between Roosevelt's nationalism, social reform, anti-boss democracy, and the practical desire to defeat both old parties. Once the presidency was lost, those elements did not all pull in the same direction. Reform could continue in states, in Congress, and in public argument, but the bull moose moment had passed its highest point. Wilson's presidency would adopt and reshape several progressive impulses, including tariff reform, banking reform, antitrust legislation, and later labor measures. This complicated Roosevelt's position. The Democrat he had opposed now occupied the executive office and began carrying out reforms that changed the national government in ways Roosevelt could not dismiss entirely. At the same time, Roosevelt disliked Wilson's temperament, his rhetoric, and what he saw as excessive abstraction. The rivalry did not end with the election. It shifted into judgment from outside power. For Taft, defeat eventually opened a different road. He would later become Chief Justice of the United States, the judicial role that suited his temperament far better than the presidency had. The bitterness with Roosevelt would soften in time, though the wound of 1912 remained part of both lives. Their rupture had been political, but it had also been human, a break between men who had trusted, used, misunderstood, and finally injured one another. In that sense, the broken party reflected a broken friendship, and the broken friendship reflected a party no longer able to decide what kind of republic it wanted to defend. Roosevelt emerged from 1912 diminished in office-seeking power, but not in public intensity. He had lost the presidency, split his party, survived a bullet, and shown that reform politics could gather enormous energy around a national executive vision. He had also revealed the danger of a movement so closely tied to one personality. The country had hurt him, but it had not restored him. For a man who believed that struggle itself gave life meaning, defeat did not bring stillness. It sent him toward harsher landscapes, sharper criticism of Wilson, and final years in which the old appetite for action had to contend with age, injury, and grief. Chapter 14: River, War, and the Last Fight. The country that had once seemed too small for Theodore Roosevelt's appetite for action now began to move beyond his reach. After the election of 1912, he remained one of the most recognizable men in America, but he no longer held the office through which his will could become policy. Woodrow Wilson occupied the White House. The Republican Party, though wounded by the Bull Moose break, still contained men who distrusted Roosevelt's insurgency. The Progressive Party had shown strength, but not enough to govern. For Roosevelt, defeat did not bring inward peace. It left him with motion still inside him, and no public office large enough to receive it. Brazil offered another field of exertion. In 1913, Roosevelt joined an expedition into South America with his son Kermit and the Brazilian explorer Cândido Rondon, a soldier, engineer, and experienced leader whose work in mapping and telegraph construction had already taken him deep into the country's interior. The expedition's most famous task became the descent of a poorly known river, later called the Rio Roosevelt, and previously known to the party as the River of Doubt. The name had a fitting severity. It suggested not romance, but uncertainty, incomplete maps, difficult water, and the limits of confidence when geography had not yet been made obedient to paper. Rondon was not merely Roosevelt's guide. He represented another tradition of national expansion, one rooted in Brazil's own effort to survey, connect, and administer its interior. His methods were disciplined, scientific, and shaped by long experience with indigenous communities, soldiers, engineers, and field conditions. Roosevelt admired competence, and in Rondon he found a man whose authority did not depend on noise. The expedition therefore placed two forceful public men beside one another, one a former American president seeking another test, the other a Brazilian officer whose life had already been spent turning remote territory into mapped knowledge. The river journey was harsher than Roosevelt had expected. Heavy canoes, dangerous rapids, uncertain food supplies, insects, fever, injury, and the strain of movement through difficult country wore down the party. The expedition was not a staged adventure arranged for easy newspaper triumph. It was a serious and dangerous undertaking, and Roosevelt was no longer the young ranchman of Dakota or the colonel of 1898. He was in his mid-50s, carrying the accumulated damage of a hard life and the wound left from the Milwaukee shooting. His will remained formidable. His body had become less willing to obey it. A leg injury became infected, and fever weakened him. At one point, Roosevelt reportedly believed he might become a burden to the party and suggested that he be left behind so the others could continue. Kermit would not accept that. The father who had turned discipline into a family creed now depended on the son moving beside him through exhaustion, worry, and practical difficulty. The moment stripped away some of the public surface from the strenuous life. Courage did not always look like a charge, a speech, or a command. It could look like being carried forward by others when self-command had begun to fail. The expedition succeeded in adding geographic knowledge, but the cost to Roosevelt was severe. He returned with his health damaged, and he never fully recovered the physical resilience that had once seemed inseparable from his public image. The River of Doubt became another chapter in the Roosevelt legend, yet it was also a warning written on the body. He had spent a lifetime answering weakness with exertion, and the method had carried him far. In Brazil, exertion brought him close to the edge of what effort could repair. Back in the United States, the world itself was changing. In 1914, Europe entered the First World War after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the chain of mobilizations and declarations that followed. Roosevelt watched the conflict with intense attention, reading it through his long-standing beliefs about preparedness, national honor, and the danger of weakness in the face of aggression. Wilson declared American neutrality, and many Americans wanted no part in a European war whose alliances and causes seemed distant from ordinary life in the United States. Roosevelt did not share that distance for long. Preparedness became one of his central public causes. He argued that the United States needed a stronger army, better training, greater readiness, and a clearer sense of national obligation. The old naval thinker, the former assistant secretary, the Rough Rider, and the president who had sent the Great White Fleet around the world all spoke through this argument. To Roosevelt, peace without preparedness invited humiliation. Neutrality that refused moral judgment seemed to him less like wisdom than evasion. Wilson's caution irritated him not only as policy, but as temperament. The conflict between Roosevelt and Wilson grew increasingly bitter. Wilson's language was careful, legal, and often elevated, while Roosevelt's criticism was direct and personal. He attacked what he saw as weakness after German submarine warfare raised the stakes for Americans, especially after the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. Wilson tried to keep the United States out of war while defending neutral rights through diplomacy. Roosevelt believed the moment required more forceful action. Their disagreement reflected more than partisan rivalry. It was a clash between two visions of moral leadership under pressure. Roosevelt also wanted to serve if war came. He proposed raising a volunteer division, imagining that he might once again lead men in the field as he had in 1898. The idea had enormous symbolic force and very little appeal to the Wilson administration. When the United States entered the war in 1917, Wilson refused Roosevelt permission to organize such a force. From a military standpoint, the refusal was understandable. Roosevelt was aging, physically weakened, politically hostile to the administration, and far removed from the professional command structure the Army needed. To Roosevelt, the refusal felt like a denial of service and honor. His sons served instead. Ted, Archie, Quentin, and Kermit all entered the war in different capacities, and their service turned the conflict from public argument into family danger. Roosevelt had long preached that public duty should be borne by the sons of prominent families as well as by ordinary citizens. Now that principle entered his own household. The burden was not theoretical. Wounds, illness, separation, and the possibility of death moved through the Roosevelt family just as they moved through thousands of other families whose names were not known to newspapers. Quentin Roosevelt's death in 1918 struck hardest. A young pilot in the American Air Service, Quentin was shot down over France in July of that year. He had been the youngest of Roosevelt's children, lively, beloved, and associated in family memory with the crowded warmth of the White House years. His death brought the war into Roosevelt's private life with a severity that even his public stoicism could not absorb. He had sent his sons towards service because he believed in the code he had preached. The code did not spare him the cost of believing it. Roosevelt bore Quentin's death before the public with the old language of sacrifice, but those close to him saw the wound. He had known grief before, at 25, when Alice and his mother died in the same house on the same day. He had answered that grief by flight to Dakota. Now age, illness, and circumstance gave him less room to flee. The sorrow of 1918 gathered around an already weakened body. His public voice remained sharp, but the physical man behind it had grown tired. Politics still called to him. By 1918, many Republicans again regarded Roosevelt as a possible candidate for the presidency in 1920. The Progressive Party had faded as an independent force, and wartime politics had rearranged old hostilities. Roosevelt himself did not abandon the possibility. He criticized Wilson's conduct of the war and later his plans for peace, especially when Wilson moved toward the League of Nations. Roosevelt was not an isolationist. He believed in international responsibility, but he distrusted agreements that seemed to him to lack force, clarity, and protection for American sovereignty. The end of the war in November 1918 did not give him satisfaction in any simple form. Germany's defeat confirmed some of his arguments about preparedness and force, but the cost had been enormous, and Quinton was gone. Wilson traveled to Europe for the peace conference, taking on the role of global statesman that Roosevelt might once have imagined for himself. The old president watched another man occupy the center of world attention. He could still write, criticize, advise, and provoke, but the central stage belonged elsewhere. Sagamore Hill became the place where the final movement of his life gathered. The house at Oyster Bay had long been more than a residence. It was family headquarters, political meeting place, writing room, memory chamber, and refuge after public storms. Its rooms held books, skins, trophies, letters, furniture, and the marks of a family that had lived under national attention for many years. Edith Roosevelt kept the household's order with the restraint that had often balanced her husband's overflow. Visitors still came, but the life inside the house had changed. Roosevelt's body continued to fail. The old asthma of childhood had been answered by discipline, and many later injuries had been answered by movement. But there are forms of physical decline that do not yield to character. The Brazilian expedition had weakened him. The wound from Milwaukee remained part of his history. Recurrent illness and inflammatory trouble wore at him. In early January 1919, he was at Sagamore Hill, still writing and still engaged with public matters, but no longer capable of the old restorations. On January 6, 1919, Theodore Roosevelt died in his sleep at the age of 60. The phrase often attached to his death came from Vice President Thomas R. Marshall, who said that death had to take Roosevelt sleeping because if he had been awake, there would have been a fight. The line endured because it matched the public memory of the man almost too perfectly. Yet the quieter fact may matter more. After all the offices, journeys, speeches, hunts, reforms, quarrels, ceremonies, and campaigns, his life ended not in public contest, but in the stillness of his own house. Theodore Roosevelt left behind no single legacy that can be made simple without distortion. He strengthened the presidency and enlarged expectations of executive leadership. He challenged corporate arrogance without rejecting capitalism. He mediated labor conflict without becoming a labor radical. He protected public lands while speaking often in the language of conquest and masculine use. He invited Booker T. Washington to dine at the White House and later wronged black soldiers in the Brownsville affair. He loved peace when peace had strength behind it, and he loved force more than later generations can always admire. His life does not resolve into one moral shape. It does, however, reveal a central movement in American history. Through Roosevelt, the presidency became louder, more visible, more personal, and more willing to intervene in the industrial and global age. The United States he entered as a sickly child in 1858 was not the United States he left in 1919. In that span, the country passed through Civil War memory, Western expansion, industrial concentration, overseas empire, progressive reform, conservation, and World War. Roosevelt did not cause all of these transformations, but he moved through many of them with such force that his life became one way of seeing the nation change. At Sagamore Hill, the public man receded into objects. Books remained on shelves, letters rested in files, mounted animals, portraits, furniture, and family rooms held the residue of a crowded life. Outside the house, the land of Oyster Bay carried on without needing the arguments that had once filled its rooms. Far away, Forests set aside under his authority continued to stand. Canyons and monuments remained under federal protection. The Panama Canal carried ships through the divided land between two oceans. The office he had enlarged waited for other presidents, other crises, and other forms of ambition. Theodore Roosevelt had spent his life pushing against limits, the limit of breath, the limit of grief, the limit of party discipline, the limit of corporate power, the limit of national hesitation, the limit of land treated as endless, the limit of retirement itself. Some limits yielded, some resisted, some answered him with consequences he could not master. In the end, the fight was not the whole meaning of his life, but it was the motion by which he met nearly everything placed before him. And after that motion ended, the physical world he had helped preserve remained, less loud than the man and longer lived than the quarrels. Forests held their slopes, water moved through the canal locks, the rooms at Sagamore Hill settled into memory. Across the wide American distances he had loved, protected, hunted, governed, and argued over, the land continued under weather, under morning light, under the long patience of things that outlast a human voice. The journey is complete. Rest well.